Hello, everybody. In this episode, I'll be speaking with Shea Levy. Shea is a programmer who's interested in identifying and promoting paradigm-shifting views, such as the use of functional programming for software engineering. In the ninth grade, he read the book Atlas Shrugged, and since then he's been learning about and living by the philosophy of Objectivism. One note before the episode begins, the episode contains a discussion of the ethics of suicide that includes explicit description of painful deaths between minutes 36 and 47, as well as further discussion of the ethics of suicide until minute 52. You can probably skip those parts and still understand the rest if you want to. Shea, welcome to the filing cabinet.
Thanks for having me. I love the name.
Yeah, I can't take credit. I spent a while trying to come up with names and doing a very bad job until a housemate came up with this one.
Nice.
Yeah. So first of all, for people who maybe haven't heard of it, especially I think Objectivism is somewhat well known in America, but much less known outside it. What is Objectivism?
Yeah. So, the first thing to know is that Objectivism is a philosophy. It's an entire worldview, a system of ideas about the fundamentals about man's life and how he should live, his relationship to reality. So, for the very brief intro to philosophy as such, right, there's what is the nature of reality? Are there miracles, or is everything governed by cause and effect? There's metaphysics. There's what is how do we know things? How do human beings learn? How do you validate knowledge? What is knowledge? That's epistemology. There's how should people live? How should we act? How should we guide our lives? By what principles? That's ethics. These are the sort of core branches of philosophy. And then there's politics, which most people are aware of. And then Rand included aesthetics as well as a major branch of philosophy. And so, and I mentioned Rand, but I realized you're talking for people who don't know anything about it. So Objectivism is the philosophy of Ayn Rand. She was a novelist and philosopher in the 20th century. She was a Russian immigrant, but she was very much American in every way that counts. Her major works, her major fiction works are The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, which are very philosophical novels, and they were and still are very, very popular in the U.S. and gaining popularity around the world in different countries. But then after her novels, and actually in the process of writing her novels, she developed her philosophy in order to achieve what she wanted to with her novels, which was to portray the ideal man. And then having done so, she, especially after The Fountainhead, starting after The Fountainhead, but especially after Atlas Shrugged, which was her last major work of fiction, she had a sort of a following of people who are interested in learning more about the ideas. And so she then sort of spent most of the rest of her life elaborating on her ideas in periodicals, sort of covering the news of the day, as well as a few more kind of timeless pieces. Even the more journalistic articles, they often covered sort of deeper philosophical points. But then she also had a few works, in particular, work on a treatise on epistemology that was elaborating her philosophical view. So Objectivism is her philosophy. And the basic principles of it are that in metaphysics, that existence exists independent of man's mind and consciousness, that things are run by cause and effect, that we are aware of the world, we are in contact with reality, we can know reality, but we don't control it with our minds, nor is there any supernatural mind that controls the world. It is what it is, independent of us. In epistemology, that man's only source of knowledge is reason on the basis of sense perception. There's no revelation, there's no intuition, there's no automatic path to conceptual knowledge, but there is a path to knowledge. Objective truth is possible if you use the right methodology. And ethics, it's rational egoism, a principled approach to life oriented around achieving your own happiness, and the can be boiled down to think and work is the sort of very sort of nutshell way to do it. And then in politics, capitalism, laissez-faire, undiluted, no regulations, capitalism, based on individual rights and men interacting with each other on the basis of trade.
Okay. And you mentioned that that Rand considered like aesthetics one of the main things of the
Yes.
philosophy. I'm wondering, similar to those like punchy things you mentioned for the other branches, is there some punchy way of summarizing up?
It's a good question. So first, I just want to flag that, well, in different places, Rand does and doesn't mention aesthetics as a branch. And
Okay.
I don't know the full details about why and when. And that's true for other objectivist philosophers. They'll sometimes call it as a branch and sometimes not. And it's the area this is the area I'm more, I know what objectivism says, but I don't really have a full first-handed grasp on the position. But her basic view is that the nature of art is to concretize and present the artist's basic metaphysical value judgments. Now, what's a metaphysical value judgment is like a metaphysical stance on a stance on the basic nature of the world as it pertains to man's life. So things like, do we have choice, and are we able to succeed in the world, or are we just doomed to failure? Are we built in with tragic flaws that will ultimately undermine everything we do? Is the world knowable, or is it an interminable chaos? Those sorts of basic views about the world, which may be implicit in the artist, are ultimately concretized in the work of art. And her view is that the reason man needs art is because these metaphysical issues, the metaphysical, both the abstract stances as well as the value judgments that follow from them, are extremely crucial to life, but they're also extremely abstract and can't be held easily as a unity in their abstract, sort of explicit form. But having them concretized in a work of art and contemplating that allows one to really hold one's worldview or somebody else's worldview, but still understand what is being presented. So if you look at if you want to understand objectivism, I think you'll do better if you only did one thing. I would rather you read Atlas Shrugged than read all of Rand's nonfiction and all of the nonfiction following, because Atlas Shrugged will show you objectivism. Now, the point of art is not didactic. The point is the experience in and of itself. So it's not meant to teach, but it's meant to portray. And so that's her general view. And so the consequence of that is a school of art she calls romantic realism, and the romanticism from her perspective, her essence, her analysis of the essence of the romantic movement in art was that it's the movement based on the idea that man has free will and is the master of his own life ultimately. Now, different romantic writers and artists had different philosophical views they brought to that table, but they included that. And realism in that was that it was possible to succeed here now in normal life, not in some historical past age, not in some mythical future age. So her artwork was all contemporary. Now it's timeless in the sense that she doesn't think that only people in 1950s America can read Atlas Shrugged, but it was presented in a way that, yes, this is a way I could live now. Or maybe I am living now one of the good or bad ways that are portrayed of life. And so her view was that was the proper form of art, but that there was value in other kinds of art under some circumstances. And there were other forms of art that there aren't valuable at all. So, yeah.
All right. So in your answer about what is objectivism, you refer to Ayn Rand a lot. I'm wondering, how much is objectivism tied up with the person of Ayn Rand? Or for instance, can you be an objectivist and say oh yeah, I think according to objectivism, Ayn Rand was wrong about this thing? Or
yeah, so you absolutely can. I mean, there's limits to it, right? So there's and this is something where I think the intellectual movement of objectivists needs to solve this problem. But basically, there's no good term for somebody who is in Rand's tradition but doesn't agree with her philosophy fully, but is I think the right term should be Randian. That has a history of a smear term, so there's hesitance to that. But yes, objectivism itself is her philosophy, but philosophy on her own terms is the principles, the general, the abstract formulations, the whole system. It's not every single particular concrete application. So, I mean, an easy example is she had it wasn't even her, like, this is the way it has to be. It was a sort of an article talking about potential ways we could fund government in a tax-free society, right?
Hmm.
And you might look at those and say none of those don't work, or those aren't the right way. The right way should be this, like, so she one of the things she says, I think, is about having a lottery. And you say, why should a government have a lottery at all? Like, why wouldn't a private organization do better? Whatever. You could make that case, and that's not at all dissenting from objectivism. That's a superficial one. There are people who kind of want to draw the lines, I think, tendentiously, of saying, like, oh, I'm basically an objectivist, but the most egregious example of this I've seen is people who want to say that objectivism is compatible with anarchism. I mean, Rand had a very particular view on the purpose and nature of government and why it was it was absolutely vital. She was explicitly opposed to anarchism. Now somebody could say, look, based on her earlier principles, the actual consistent application of them is anarchism. I think that's wrong, but that's at least a more colorable view. But it's not objectivism anymore, right? Objectivism is an entire system. It's an entire integrated body of ideas that ultimately stands or falls together. But now her personal likes, the way she lived her life, unfortunately, there hasn't been a great biography of her. The few biographies there are have been, from what I understand, and I haven't validated this firsthand, but from what I understand, have been by people who had an axe to grind or other, whether political or against her personally or something along those lines. But either way, there's sort of clear controversy in her life that people like to pay attention to. And you could reasonably ask, is this a necessary consequence of objectivism? Or you could also ask, is this her not being consistent? Or you could ask, was this actually okay, right? These are all legitimate questions to ask, but only the first one is actually like part of the philosophical question, right? My assessment of her from everything I know is that she was a genius, and both in her life and in her work did extraordinary work and had extreme integrity. And so as far as I know, everything I can validate firsthand, she was a great person and embodied her world. And she, in fact, in her afterword for her books is something like, "And I mean it," something along those lines. And I think that's true, but I'm not an expert on her life. If it turned out that no, there were things that I really thought, wow, she's really not living up to this, that wouldn't change my mind about her ideas. It wouldn't make me not an objectivist in my estimate. It would only be if I actually disagreed with her philosophy on some issue or other.
Okay. This is a bit tangential, but like, I'm kind of surprised that there isn't some, like, I don't know, quasi-official objectivist biography of Ayn Rand. Like, normally when people spark movements, like, the movement wants to sort of talk about them, right?
Yeah. So there are different sources that cover different aspects. I think there are a few things. So one is, I know during her lifetime, there was an oral history project. And the problem was that was undertaken by people who ended up betraying her and kind of breaking off from the movement. And so if anybody who's familiar with the story of Objectivism knows about the Brandons, anybody who's familiar with them as a movement, and they basically, Nathaniel Brandon was at one point her protege. Like the main organized movement was under the Nathaniel Brandon Institute. He gave classes under her imprimatur. He wrote many articles in her newsletter, that sort of thing. And there's a whole sordid story of him basically having lied to her for years about many things and breaking in a really dramatic fashion. So that was part of it. Was some of the earliest work was done by the Brandons. And then I don't know exactly why. So I know there's an upcoming biography that is about her up through the publication of Atlas Shrugged. So about Rand as a fiction writer, which is a much less studied part of her life anyway. Most people are interested in after Atlas, which I think is 57. After Atlas in the 60s and 70s, her leading a cultural, intellectual, political movement has been much more studied. But yeah, I can't say. And then the other thing is that one thing that might be a factor is that the person who is her heir to her estate and sort of the main expert in objectivism, the one who trained under her for 30 years, Leonard Peikoff, and is still alive And I think there is, now, not to say that there's like going anything awful about him that would be said, but more just, I think there is sensitivity within the people who respect her that we don't want to like dig into personal issues while he's still around to see it and be part of it. I don't know that that's the case, but I could easily see that being part of it. But there is there's a project called the Ayn Rand Archives, which holds all of her papers and things. So you can go there and like see her handwritten manuscripts of things and that sort of thing. And they are in general interested in preserving her legacy and supporting efforts to do that. I wouldn't be surprised if coming out of that at some point in the next 20 years, there were like a real authoritative, this is her life story.
Okay. So getting back to Objectivism a bit, one thing that strikes me as kind of surprising is like normally, or in academic philosophy, for instance, there'll be a view, like somebody will have a view on like political philosophy, or they'll have a view on epistemology or something. And it's kind of surprising to see like some stance which encompasses like, this is like, it's both ethics and epistemology and metaphysics and like political philosophy and aesthetics and, maybe a few other things. Like how, I don't know if it's possible to answer this without just like going into the details, but like how does that happen?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing is it's not like she doesn't have stances that you can isolate to a specific branch, right? Like she thinks that, like, so there, she has this principle, the primacy of existence, which is existence exists independent of consciousness. The causal function of consciousness is to create awareness, not to create existence. Right? That's clearly essentially a metaphysical stance, belongs in metaphysics, has massive implications, of course. And actually, there's one way you can look at her philosophy as a systematic application of the primacy of existence to every question in philosophy. But it is a metaphysical stance. And they're often, now not everything, but often you can clearly isolate. But part of this is her view of the role of philosophy, which is very unusual today, but as far as I can tell, is not historically completely unique to her, which is that the whole point and purpose of philosophy is to provide an integrated worldview. That it is to provide a worldview. It's not just there's a certain set of questions that we've decided are philosophical and you can talk on any one. No, you can't talk about any of them. In fact, you can't talk about anything. Like part of her view is that you need philosophy for all adult human endeavors. That you have a philosophy or you have philosophical views. You may not have a full philosophy. You have philosophical views, whether you know it or not, once you're an adult, once you're at the level of sort of full mature thinking and approaching the world. You have no choice about that. Your only choice is whether you do the work to make them explicit, validate those principles, and integrate them into an entire system. And you see this, I don't know if Plato is self-conscious about this, but you see this like part of what makes Plato distinctive is that he's the first one to come on the scene and produce a system, right? He doesn't just have answers in one field or another. He sees all of these things, and then he's talking about, he looks at the earlier Socratic dialogues are talking about issues of morality and justice and all that, but then he's tracing them back to their epistemic roots. And then ultimately you can see his whole system as flowing out of his basic metaphysical principles. And there are other philosophers like that, but certainly not today. And I think one difference today is that the predominantly accepted view of philosophy, which is itself a philosophical view on Rand's view, like what philosophy is a philosophical question. But the predominant view of philosophy is anti-integration, anti-system building. There are no integrated answers. There are no, all we can do is take things piecemeal and, work on our little things in isolation, which is a philosophical view she rejects. Yeah. So that's, so how it happens is you start with the issues that you care about. So for her starting point was ethics and values. And what one way to put it is, and this is overly personalized, but I think it's helpful to see, is like she noticed from a very young age there was something different about the way she operated, like the way she cared about things and the people around her, right? Like what she cared about, what she wanted, and the way she wanted things, not just what, but why, and how she went after the things she wanted. And she had the question, why, what makes me different than them? And then in particular, when she decides, she's 12, I think, when she decides that she wants to be an author and wants to write stories. And she wants to ultimately formulate this in terms of wants to portray the ideal man, the best. Like, so she needs to know, how does the ideal man live? What, she knows, she has a sense of what she likes and what she doesn't, and she has reasons for them. It's not just completely subjective, but she doesn't have a full detailed answer. So she starts thinking about that in the process of her work and her life, and starting to see, okay, well, these ethical issues ultimately rest on different, on more fundamental epistemic and metaphysical issues. And ultimately she comes to view philosophy as basically epistemology. I think it's a little, you can make too much of it, but the basic, like that, the core crux ultimately often comes down to epistemic issues, particularly your view on the nature of concepts. But that's not her starting point. That's not what gets her interested. That's just what she needs to fully answer her questions. And she holds that that's what you need to live any life. Whatever you're doing, you do actually need answers to all these questions. You need them to be integrated if you want to be successful.
Okay, cool. So you mentioned that she sort of started with ethics, and let's maybe dive into that first. I think, like, if people know one thing about Rand's ethics, it might be that she or there's some sense that she rejects altruism and she's in favor of selfishness.
Yes,
basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. What? Yeah. First of all, what does she mean by altruism in this context?
Yeah. So I think before we answer that question directly, the first thing to call out is that Rand sees ethics as the entire purpose of ethics is to identify principles of human action. That you need a principled world, you need a principled view in order to act long range, in order to live a human life. You can't go range of the moment. You can't just have individual isolated determinations. And so her answer to that question is going to be to identify the principle, even if people don't consistently apply it themselves. So that's just as a preface to the answer, which is altruism is the moral code which holds that the good is the good of others. The good, that what is good is to give up your life to serve the lives of others, to make the happiness or success or wealth or whatever, however you want to frame the good. And this is part of the problem, is however you want to frame the good is not actually part of the content of altruism. Part of the problem with altruism is that it doesn't actually answer the question, what is good? All it says is what's good is not you. What's good is for somebody else, or for God, or for society. But it doesn't actually say what good is and why. But so, yeah, that's her basic view. So I think if you look at basically any... So, I mean, actually, before we look at sort of more explicit philosophical ethics, just look at the way people talk about values and goodness today, right? There's this view that, like, for example, let's say choosing your career, right? There's this view that, okay, obviously there are some careers are really immoral because you're, selling tobacco to kids or whatever. That's obviously bad. But within the range of like whatever careers are, like, that's not a moral question, right? That's just, you do what you do as long as you're not hurting others. Like, what does it matter? That's just about you. Like, it's like, just like saying, oh, well, it's not a moral question whether you get vanilla or chocolate ice cream. Whereas for Rand, no, like, this is a profoundly moral question of, this is shaping your life. This is going to, like, it absolutely has to tie into your deepest values and what's most important to you. But because to the altruist consideration is like, what do you give to charity? I mean, the sort of, and the effective altruists in the audience are thinking, well, no, we take it more seriously. We apply it more fully. We apply it to your job because your job has impact. But the typical altruist, the altruist on the street, he does whatever job he does. He has whatever entertainment he wants. And then, okay, once a year at tax time, he figures out where he's going to donate to. And that's what makes him good. Or if you look at somebody like Bill Gates, right?
Yep.
He builds this incredibly productive enterprise at Microsoft. He makes the home computer possible. He does all of this incredible work, enriches his own life and the lives of everybody he's trading with. What does he think makes him good? Not any of that, but the way he's given his money away afterwards. That work was at best amoral, if not immoral. And what matters is now he's giving it away. Now he's helping the world. Now and notice that I think you can make a good argument I mean, you could definitely make a good argument. Like this, I think this is a fact that if your actual metric was the welfare of others, his work at Microsoft did much more to improve the lives of people around him. But it wasn't motivated by that. It wasn't driven by that, and therefore by the altruist ethos. It's not actually altruism, right? Even though, okay, it happened to help others, what really matters. And now here's to credit the effective altruists in the audience. I think those guys are better at that particular aspect, but they still take the basic premise that the goal is to maximize the good for others. And that's what her view is. And her ultimate analysis of it is that it's ultimately a negation of values. There's no positive view of the value. It's just a negative view of value things, figure out what you want, and then give that up. Figure out what's good for you and destroy it. And it's ultimately a morality of death is how she puts it. And that's what it has to lead to. The more consistent application, the closer to death. And that Mother Teresa is a great example of what altruism means if taken seriously. And her life was miserable, and she died in a miserable death. And that, she thinks, is the natural consequence of taking altruism seriously.
Okay. I'd like to go a little bit more into that, but perhaps after we just give Rand's positive vision for what we should be selfish. Like, what does that mean? If I just do whatever I want, am I being selfish?
No. So, yeah. So Rand's view is that, so I mentioned earlier that she thought objective knowledge was possible, and that includes in the realm of values, that there are objective answers to what is valuable and what is not, and that is not valuable separate, like it's not intrinsic in the universe that, an apple is valuable. It is a relational value is a relational phenomenon between things in the universe and the living being, but nor is it just a consequence of like what you feel, right? So no, just doing what you want is not selfish. And if you look at the people who actually do that, what values do they actually have, right? They just got kind of whims of the moment. They don't build anything long-term. They don't have anything they're actually trying to build. They're not actually trying to figure out like, what is a good way to live? They're just going by the seat of their pants. It's often ending in disaster because if you're not thinking, you're not actually doing it, you're not actually going to be successful. But also the things that they're aiming for are ultimately shaped by whatever thinking they've done in the past or whatever sort of vague feelings they get that the people around them approve of or not. And so part of the answer to your direct question depends on her view of emotions, which is that they're not built in. So there's no built-in preferences. I mean, there's sensory perceptual pleasure pain mechanism, and you have built-in capabilities to experience certain emotions. But what you will find pleasing, like what we would find on the emotional level rather than the sort of the physical level, what you will find desirable, pleasurable, or aversive, bad, will depend on your past thinking, has been automatized and is being applied, and your current evaluation of the current situation. So ultimately, what it amounts to go on your emotions of the moment is to say, my past thinking was good enough. I don't need to think about this issue fresh, and I'm just going to go by that, no matter come what may, above what I don't think. So that was a negative answer to but you want the positive.
Sure.
So the positive view here is that. So Rand's mature view is that values are ultimately rooted in the phenomenon of life, and it's not that you need to be alive in order to pursue values. That's almost nobody rejects that, but it's more that the very phenomenon of something being valuable only makes sense in context and in reference to the life of the organism that is valuing it. So she has this a theory, and I can get into the details if that's interesting. But basically, she has a theory of that. Like the ultimate root of value is life. The ultimate end in itself is life. It's a process of self-sustaining, self-generated action that keeps itself going, and it's an end in itself. And all other values are to be understood in that context and lead to that context. So for man, the question of what is moral, why do we need morality? I mentioned this earlier. Her view is, because we need to, man's life is a lifelong range. His mind has to be operated by choice. It operates on the abstract level. It's not like an animal where he can just go around and do what's right in front of him and react however he reacts, and he'll either live or not, right? You have to plan long-term to live a human life. So you need principles to be able to deal with the issues that come up. And specifically, those principles are organized around what are the requirements of man's life. And for Rand, the essence of man as a biological being is his rational faculty. That's his basic means of survival, is his mind, is his ability to reason and operate in the world on the basis of his reason. That is the basic requirement of his life. And so her ethics is the body of principles required to properly sustain and act on your mind. So she's got, so her core virtue is rationality, which she sees as divided up into several sort of subsidiary virtues that are aspects of rationality. I gave this sort of, there's this ultimate virtue and subsidiary virtues, and a lot of people are thinking this is going to be some like deductive system where she's proven them out and that they're exactly 7. And her view is no, it's an inductive process. You could have come to these subsidiary virtues first in any order, and then seen that rationality is the common integrating factor. But so, for example, honesty is a virtue for Rand, not primarily because you owe something to other people, but because faking reality is using your mind, is setting your mind to the task of destroying reality, of not of figuring out what's true, but of creating a world that you would wish you were in, that is not actually the world you are in. So that results in you, to the extent you're successful, with air quotes, in the moment, you are putting the work of your mind to convincing others of falsehoods instead of learning the truth and applying the truth. And you then become dependent on others' weaknesses so that they accept your truth. You become threatened by them being successful, but you're also dependent on their mind because you're not using your own. That's not very well concretized, but I just want to kind of show that there's one, like that honesty is a virtue in many ethical theories, but the reason it's a virtue for Rand is because it's necessary to use your mind properly, to not fake reality, to accept reality as it is and act accordingly, and not pretend that you can make it otherwise to yourself or to others. Another virtue that is less commonly seen one is productiveness. Now, for her, this is one of the central virtues, right? We need to be productive because the virtue of productiveness is the virtue of applying your mind to long-term work that builds upon itself and reaches higher and higher heights of achievement, in material achievement in the world, things created in the world, not just things in your head, not just thinking things through and I've got this beautiful theory, but even if you're a scientist, your result has to be written down and published in an objective form that can be then used by others and ultimately sustain your life through trade if that's what you're doing. Or so that productive work is not just, oh, this just happens to be a thing we need, but no, this is the essence of human life, is productive work, doing this work, and to do it well and to do it according to your mind properly. That is an essential virtue. And then she also has sort of core abstract values that her 3, what she calls the cardinal values, are reason, purpose, and self-esteem. So reason is you're pursuing your own intellectual faculty. So that includes methodology, like learning how to reason effectively, but it primarily includes content. Knowing more things, enables you to be more effective in the world, and is the purpose of your mind, is to learn more concrete things, not to learn how to learn. Purpose is to have your values organized around important ends that you care about in a hierarchy, with a sort of central purpose that is not the end, not everything in your life is guided toward, but is the thing around which everything is organized, which is your career, right? So for Rand, her central purpose, you could say, at least up until publication of Atlas, is the portrayal of the ideal man. It's not that everything she did was directly in service of that, but that was her main life's work. Again, that's a major part of her ethics. And again, this is all tied back to, what are the requirements of man's life? What do I actually need to live? Now so to get back to your question about what do I feel like, it's ultimately the ultimate end purpose is my own happiness, which for her is an aspect of successful life. It's not just a current feel. It's not just a short-term feeling. Happiness is the form in which living successfully and achieving one's values is experienced. So it includes emotional aspects. It includes cognitive aspects of knowing that you're successful and being able to continue to be successful. But it's ultimately inseparable from the actual success. You can't be happy if you're not successful fully. Like even you might think you're happy, you might think you're successful, and so have some of the emotional aspects, but it's not sustainable. So ultimately, to say your happiness is your goal is to say your life is your goal. It's just a different perspective on the same issue. And so that ultimately, what your happiness is will depend in part on what values you've already formed, which are most easily accessible through your emotions, right? By the time you're asking these questions, by the time you're at the philosophical stage, you've had, if you're incredibly precocious, 9 years, and most likely 16 to 20 years of living already, where you've valued things, you've pursued some things and not others, and there are some values that are illegitimate. Most of what you value are things that can ultimately be contextualized as a way of living a human life. So you should take that into account when pursuing your life. And so there is an element of personal choice. There's a significant element of personal choice in her ethics. It's not like there's one way to live, there's one career to have. But it's not arbitrary. It's not just whatever I feel like. It's integrating that into a full self-sustaining life.
Okay. So, man, I have a few questions about that positive vision. I guess the first one is, if I think about ethics as like, or value as primarily being about sustaining human life, or sustaining my own life. So, I don't know, one ethical issue that sometimes pops up is the idea of assisted suicide, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can imagine somebody who's like, maybe like they only have like so much left to live, given our best medical knowledge, and like they find, like maybe breathing is painful or something. They're like not enjoying it, and you can imagine them saying like, "Well, I could kill myself, and indeed that would shorten my life, but like I don't know, it doesn't seem that good to be alive for not that much longer." What, like, do you think this person is just confused, or they just don't want to be?
No. So first of all, I don't want to give spoilers, but there is a scene in one of Rand's novels that this issue comes up, and it's made very clear that no, there are situations where choosing to die is the right choice.
Okay.
I'll talk about that. But the first thing I want to say before we get into that is that Rand thinks in general, intellectual issues and especially philosophical issues, you start with the central normal cases. And then the corner cases, the borderline issues need to be understood in terms of that. So there is an answer to your question, but this isn't the starting point when thinking about ethical issues. Is what about the person for whom assisted suicide makes sense? But there is an answer, which is basically that life for Rand is not just the continued beating of a heart. It's an entire process that is in fact self-sustaining, in fact over time something that in principle can keep building and going on itself. And for human beings, that includes an expansion over your lifetime of your scope of values, the importance of values, and the things which come to constitute what a meaningful life is for you. Based on the nature of your mind, there are certain situations where to continue on, you couldn't actually live. It was just the only actual option in front of you is a quick death or a slow, painful death. That there are situations where a living organism, so set aside man, because that's a complicated issue, right? Think about an animal who is caught in a bear trap and can't get out and is slowly starving to death. Rand's view is not that from in the sense that's important for ethics. That animal is not living. It's dying. It's not dead, but it's currently dying. The process it's involved in is degenerating. It is slowing down. It is eating itself up. It is destroying itself. It is not an ongoing that process cannot sustain itself. That process cannot lead to further values that add to the life and keep it going indefinitely. Not literally indefinitely. Like there will be a time when things decay, but so there's that sense in which so that's the sort of deepest metaphysical sense, that to understand what she means by life, you can't just isolate out, okay, the heart has continued beating, the respiratory processes are still going. No, it's an entire organism. It's an entire entity. And this is actually something that distinguishes Rand from modern philosophers, but not, this is a very Aristotelian view, is
Hmm.
our focus is primarily on entities, not on processes, not on actions, and everything metaphysically, all the other categories, if you're familiar with that term from Aristotle's philosophy, are to be understood relative to entities, right? Actions are actions of entities. Properties are properties of entities. Relationships are relationships between entities or between other things that are ultimately, and that's, now that for Rand is sorry, I'm getting a bit afield, but just want to finish this up. That for Rand is more of an epistemic than a metaphysical view, that like this is the way in which the world, that man knows the world, is primarily entity centered. And she doesn't view entities as more metaphysically real than their properties. They're just everything exists. It just is what it is. There's no more or less realness. Anyway, back to the issue. So yes, there's a deeper metaphysical view of there's such a thing as dying without being dead. What that means concretely in the sense of like there are from a psychological perspective, there are situations where life is no longer worth living, where you cannot pursue your values as you currently understand them, nor could you put in the work to change your values and have that be worthwhile, right? You've lost an irreplaceable value, or you've done something so terrible that is going to stain and shape your character, or you're going to just be crippled and in pain for the short time that you have left. Your choice is between dying now, dying quickly, or dying slowly. And dying quickly is actually honoring your life. It is actually the thing which is most in line with your actual values, with your actual, like what your life actually would be, is to honor that, to say, I cannot have this, and I would rather not do anything than give up what life could have been. So that I question whether that's going to be convincing to somebody who isn't already sort of pretty deeply understanding and on board with the ethics as it applies to normal life, but that is ultimately the answer. And yeah, I guess another way to think about it is life, at least animal life for Rand, is not purely a material issue. It's also a spiritual issue. There's mental and physical. She doesn't believe in souls in sort of a supernatural sense, but there is a mind for man that is separate from the body. And if the body is functioning but the mind is suffering, that is not living. That is not successful living. That is not flourishing life. And now people will sometimes get caught up on the word flourishing as if it's sort of saying something different than living. For Rand, it's not. Living means living fully, living well, living healthily. So I don't want to get confused with that, like saying we're bringing in another standard here, flourishing life. No, it's the same basic issue. Does that answer your question? I realize I went on to
it kind of answers it, I guess. So if I thought that ethics was just about like keeping hearts beating and stuff, then like at least that's like a very objective, like I can really evaluate like whether something's
right.
ethical or not. If it's about like, well, are you like living to your highest values, which I thought was supposed to be a derivative concept in ethics, like now I'm less sure what's actually going on.
Yeah, so the question is, can you okay, so let's take let's see, maybe it'll be easier in the case of the animal, right? So let's say you've got a rabbit, right? Normal, healthy rabbit. It's hopping around, eating food, and then scampering away when it hears a predator, right? It's got this whole set of processes: digestion, respiration, but also awareness of the world around it, sleeping, and things like that, right? That ultimately, all of these ultimately tend towards preserving its life, right? Now imagine that rabbit has all of its paws broken, all of its limbs broken, and it's got a big gash on its side. It's continuing to respire, but like there is an entire thing which is its life, which is no longer continuing, right? There's no the processes that are ongoing that we could previously thought of as part of its life are no longer connected to an entire functioning system that can actually sustain that. So the beating of its heart is killing it, right? Because it's got a wound in its side and it's pushing, guts out the side and things like that, right? And the movement of its limbs is killing it because it's sending pain, it's causing it pain and distracting it from the world around it because it has to focus on the pain and it's not actually moving it anywhere useful, right? So all of these things
Hmm.
are still ongoing. And there's still, if you focus on the heart to the exclusion of the whole body, yes, the heart is continuing, the heart is still going, but the whole entity is not.
Yeah.
And so the idea is not that there's a sort of arbitrary decision about when that would be good enough for man. Like there are objective, I mean, there's options. So one aspect of Rand's view of objectivity is that objectivity doesn't mean necessarily that in every single situation there's only one possible rational stance, but rather that there are principles that can be followed, and there are sometimes options in terms of like what is legitimate and what is not. So she would hold, I don't think she's written directly on this, but I'm certain she would hold that, yeah, there are some realms where, like, if you're in your 60s and you lose your spouse, or let's say you're in your 80s and you lose your spouse, right? That you deeply love, like, she would probably see, yeah, there's some people for whom that would be too much, and I don't want to continue, and some people who they have other values that are worth sustaining and they can continue on their lives as best they can. But it's not the case that my life, given what I have going on, there's no legitimate justification, even if I'm sad, even if I lose my job, even if my house burns down, right? None of that by itself. Now, if my kids were in it and they all died, okay, maybe, but just like those sort of like normal but not, completely life scarring events, none of those would justify me ending my life on Rand's ethics. So it's not arbitrary. There is a question. The standard is a life that man can live, right? A life that actually is self-sustaining, where all of man's faculties, right? Especially the primary one, the rational faculty, your mind is able to function and continue. And that includes not just cognitive issues, but it's evaluative issues. So if your value hierarchy is so tied up in a particular person because they've been so deeply meaningful to you, right? It's not arbitrary to say, look, in the 10 years that I have left, there's no way for me to get over this in that time. There's no way for me to reshape my life. There's no way for me none of the rest of the values I have are meaningful enough, right? That is in principle, objectively determinable question of like, will I be able to live a life that is actually the kind of life that can sustain a human being, given my current psychological state. So it can depend on your psychological state, but without it being just because I feel like it, therefore it's true.
Okay.
Yeah. Maybe easier if we have concrete examples you want to go through, but
yeah. Maybe. So one example that I wonder that is like some attempt at providing some kind of counterexample to this is, suppose I imagine someone who's like, I don't know, some sort of like Randian villain. They like make all their, this person, they make their money by like swindling others and like lying and cheating and telling people that they should be altruistic and then like collecting the income or whatever. And that's like kind of habitual for them.
Yeah.
Right. And you could imagine somebody like this thinking, I could like start being honest and start like encouraging the virtue of selfishness or something. But like that would, like, my life up to now has been a process of like, swindling others and convincing them that they should just give me their stuff. And so like, if I change what I was doing, that would no longer like that would be so disruptive to the process I have going on that wouldn't really be life for me.
Yeah. So I mean, I do think there is a point of evil where the only honest thing you can do is kill yourself. But I do think that it's a different kind of story. So I think there are two questions. There's sort of two things we could go down. The easiest one is like, like there's a certain kind of, I don't remember if this was Rand or Peikoff, who is sort of her heir, something along the lines of like a certain kind, like a cold-blooded murderer, right? There's no way back. That if you're like, continuing life is still just a process of dependence and decay, no matter what you do. And so the only honest thing, only rational thing you can do at that point, if you sort of come to and decide to use your mind and really struggle, is no matter how I struggle, I've destroyed any chance of a life. Now I don't know that I know enough about the kind of psychology of evil to know where that line is. I'm convinced there is a line, but to know where that line is, I don't know. But there's the other side of your question, which is, why shouldn't that person just continue as they were going?
Yeah.
Right. And ultimately, Rand's answer is that that person has never been living. They're not sustaining themselves. Their victims are sustaining them. And they're to the extent that they continue down that path, they're working towards their own destruction. They're like, as the more they get involved and get in depth with the swindling, right, the more they're relying on people being stupid and being caught, and that their web of lies won't come crashing down on them. Right, the more that they have to deal with people who are less and less aware of reality, but they're also simultaneously depending on their victims' awareness of reality, because that's what's needed for their victims to survive and have values to take from them. So Rand has this view of the altruists and in general the second-hander as somebody who is a parasite on his own species, right? That other species are parasites on other species, but this parasite on his own species, simultaneously depending on and destroying the virtues he depends on to survive. And so if you were fully aware of that, you'd be stuck, right? If you were so far gone that you couldn't actually change your psychology again, and I don't know how far gone that would have to be, but if you're so far gone that like if you sort of went through the torturous effort of like, no, I'm going to actually think about what my life requires. And if I actually think about, okay, if I pull off this next swindle, yeah, maybe I can get some food for the next day, but then the people who provided me that food are going to be more and more aware of what I'm doing. I'm going to have to put more and more effort into beating them, and I can't keep doing that. And ultimately, I'm destroying that, right? If you can't hold that context fully and still do it. So this is a little bit of a tangent, but Socrates, I think it's Socrates has this view that basically the modern term is acrasia, right? That you can't know what is that something is bad and still do it. And Rand didn't agree with that, because she thought that she held that cognition, that rational cognition, is volitional, and you have to actually work to hold the full context and to think and to seek to know reality. But she did hold that if you did that, you couldn't actually act against what you know is destroying your life. So what I think would actually happen, and this is a bit like getting into like philosophy class thought experiments as opposed to guidance for living life, and this is part of her view, is like the whole point of philosophy. But like if you're let's take a more realistic example. You're somebody in the audience. You've always lived by altruism, and you're swayed by what I'm saying, and then you start to read. What do I think you would actually do? I don't think you would say, well, I'm going to immediately throw out everything I knew and did. I don't think you can do that. Part of Rand's point is that you need philosophy, you need your philosophical views, and you can't just replace them overnight, right? It's a long process of integrating conceptually. It's a long process of integrating consciously and conceptually, but also having that integrated subconsciously and actually guiding your action in a day-to-day life, and something that you can automatize and apply in your life. So I think what the actual answer would be is, all right, I'm going to the extent I understand these issues, I'm going to try to apply my new understanding as best I can. I'm going to expect that sometimes I'm going to fall back on old habits that I don't agree with and not even notice. Sometimes I'm going to fall back on them and then notice afterwards and try to rethink it. And then it's a slow, gradual process of correcting the errors. And this is true for any other error you hold. It doesn't have to be a fundamental moral error. That if you have automatized it, if you've automatized a bad pattern, you're going to have to do work to change it. But I think that's the actual thing you would do, is you would say, look, it's not like you would say, yes, this would have been a good way to live, but I haven't lived that way so far, and it's going to be too hard to do that work. Now, like you don't have to project over that time scale. You say, okay, well, I know this is true. I'm not sure about the rest. I'm going to take this new fact that I've learned, or new perspective, and apply it. Do that work now. See if my life gets better. It does get better, I think it does, right? That's my claim, is that it will get better to the extent that you seriously apply these principles. Okay, now I'm going to do the next step and slowly change my life. And insofar as you're doing that work, you are improving it. And I think the other point is, I think it's possible, and I think there are real people that really have no values, no honest, selfish, real values at all, completely corrupt and destroyed and rotten. And I don't have an answer to what that kind of person can do. I think you ultimately always have choice and you can always turn your mind on. But I think for most people, you have a lot of real values, right? Especially in like modern America, right? You have a career, you have family. Now, maybe the career was one that others chose for you, but still you found things you liked about it. You found things that you can find. And okay, maybe your current spouse is terrible for you, but like, you have a sense of what you like and what you don't like about them and all of that. So like, you have a basis to go on. It's not like we've been talking in principle, but people can be mixed. The principle should be seen unadulterated, first, understood, taken fully consistently. But most people are mixed, and you shouldn't be mixed. Like, this is not like man is fundamentally flawed and you just have to deal with that. Like, I think moral perfection is possible. But if you are mixed, you can rely on the good while dealing with the bad, and you can continue to grow the good. So I think that's the actual way it would come out for most people.
Okay, cool. I think that fleshes out. I think that helps me flesh out what do you mean by life and like that kind of ethics. I next want to kind of contrast this with like a kind of liberal utilitarian perspective. So something like it's something broadly utilitarian, roughly what I see in the effective altruism movement, which is like, okay, the thing that's good is like, we live in this like community with a bunch of humans and maybe a bunch of like, other living animals, and like there are things that are good for them and bad for them. And like basically what's good just in general is like things that are, good for all the individual things. And like, I'm one of those things. So like it's good for me to like enjoy myself. But like, to the degree that I can like take some hit, but by doing that, help the rest of the world. For instance, by donating money to charity that like actually like improves the lot of other people or non-human animals. That's like a good thing to do. Especially to the degree that it's sustainable and compatible with you, like continuing to do it. And And so this to flesh this out, this like looks like, maybe like it's a good idea to give to some charities that like improve the world in general, like even if like the benefits of those charities don't rebound to me specifically. Maybe it's a good idea to like not eat meat because like, those animals are living like horrible lives, and like why should I like force that on them? So I'm wondering like what you would say to that kind of attitude.
Yeah. So there are two answers to what I would say. And the first answer is if I'm like talking to somebody who I have goodwill with and I'm trying to bridge the gap in terms of like helping them understand my position. And then the second is to like address what I see as the essence of the view and why it's wrong. So the first thing I would say is I think there's a mixture going on in that view of some things that are legitimate values to yourself and some things that aren't, right? So I do think within a certain context, the living in a world of other people being wealthy improves my life massively. Living in a world where like life in general, like in a very generalized sense, and it's not a fundamental value. It's not, but like things living and flourishing around me, like just animal life too, like that's a value, to be in a world where there are happy, successful animals, like just to contemplate and to interact with and all of that. So there is some of that, but that wouldn't be my response if I were sort of talking in a general intellectual audience, because I think ultimately that concedes the premise too much of that there's, I think the philosophical view, I think maybe here's a better way to contrast it. There's the people, the sort of rank and file people who adopt this view. I think there are reasons that they find it appealing, but the actual philosophical view is ultimately untenable. And then the people who promulgate it, I think, are less honest and less worthy of that kind of consideration. Obviously, there's some, but so there are two kinds of things I could say. The first question is why, right? This is ultimately the thing that explodes altruism. is why? Why should I care if it doesn't redound to me, right? Why should I care if an animal in, or let's take the sort of hardline utilitarian view, because I think it's easiest to see in the most extreme principles. Why should I care if, let's say we know that there are aliens on Pluto, but they're never going to transact with us. But like I could like send a spaceship full of materials that are only found on Earth to them and know it'll get there in 100 years and then they'll be happier and healthier. Like, why should I care about that? Like you say, yes, it's true that I can identify what is good for them, right? There is that sense. And so I want to point out that this utilitarian view is parasitical on the kind of view that implicitly on the kind of view that Rand is pointing out, that there is in fact a standard of good and bad based on the organism's life. You can actually, there's a matter of fact, there's an objective answer to the question of what is good and bad for the individual organisms. And then the question is, why should I care about that? And so that would be my challenge. I don't know. I'm not, if you want to stand in and try to give an answer, I'm happy to respond, but that would be my first response. And if you want to try to give an answer, I can give my second response.
Yeah. I think, yeah. So at this point, I'll sort of try to present my own meta ethics. Rather than like attempt to speak for someone else. Like if I think about morality, like I think it's gonna come in like kind of two types of components. So one is things that like, well, one is like I don't know, something that, if I understand you correctly, seems like relatively similar to the objectivist ethics, which is like, oh, things that like, being honest even when that's kind of uncomfortable, it turns out like in the long run that's going to be good for you,
Yeah.
So part of it is going to be that, and then part of it is going to be like, well, like I think I'm going to say something like, if you could just look at what you value and what you like, and like you do, I think like probably you are going to end up finding out that like you do care about other like living conscious beings, and like yeah, maybe like on some abstract level, like there's no God telling you that you have to care about those things, or like you could live your life while like not trying to improve them, or you could like, or I don't know, you could just like roll up and die or whatever, and like all those things are possible, but like given that you find like why would someone be compelled to like, I don't know, not randomly kill themselves? Well, it's because they like living, and that seems like a good enough reason. Why would someone like want to donate some like materials only found on Earth to Pluto? Well, because they like, you might just find that that's something you in fact care about, and that's like a good enough reason.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, so the first thing I want to hit on, this is a positive point in Rand's ethics, is that in a real sense, ethics for Rand is a conditional science, in the sense that she holds that man has free will, that we have volition, and the fundamental choice is, and these are the same choices just viewed from different perspectives, is either to think or not, right? The basic choice is, am I going to use my mind to try to understand reality or not? And the or not could be either just not putting in the effort, or it could be intentionally lowering my awareness, like shutting down and evading an issue and not letting myself think about it. And that all other choices happen, not that all other choices sort of automatically reduce to that basic choice. Like you can choose to, her choice, that in the technical term is to be in focus, which is not like concentration, but it's just, am I using my mind to know reality fully or not? And so when you're in focus, there are other choices, and those other choices aren't deterministic from there. But that is your basic choice. And in Rand's view, that's equivalent to the choice of to choose existence or non-existence, or to choose life or not. So she ultimately views like life is a choice. You don't have to choose to live. You can choose not to live. But if you don't choose to live, morality has nothing to say, because morality is something in this world. And so there's another aspect, which is that these choices aren't sort of metaphysically equivalent. It's not a choice between A or B. It's a choice between A or not A. It's a choice between something or nothing. So the reason I brought that up is because you sort of mentioned like, well, why would, it seems good enough that I want to live. And there's a certain sense in which that's true, but I want to distinguish want to live in the sense of like, I feel like life is good, and choose to live, which means I exert the effort to stay in existence or not, which are not the same thing. Now, the feeling is, often helps, right? If your life is good, then it's easier to do the work to live. But the actual choice you can make, right? If your life is terrible, you can actually still choose to exert the effort. And maybe you'll find that if you do so, things will be really difficult or not. So it's not that basic choice. So basically, so her ethics depends on that basic choice. And the important things are, one, it's not emotional. It's not dependent on your previous judgments. It's not some automatic built-in preference. You choose, and it's the cause of your choice is you choosing. And there's no further explanation that can be given. And then the second point is that the choice of death is not choice of a something, right? It's a non-choice. It's an absence. It's morality has nothing to say. Ethics has nothing to say. Nothing has anything to say on non-existence. It's just go die, right? That's all you can say is curl up and die. If that's your choice. I want to contrast that with what you said of like, you find that you prefer it, right? Yep. And ultimately, that's subjectivism. That's saying, I have this feeling, that feeling, right? And remember, we have to connect to Rand's view of emotions, right? That these emotions are automatized value judgments based on your previous thinking and your analysis of the current situation. So what you're actually saying, and this is a claim that can be demonstrated, but it's not going to be immediately obvious to everybody. You have to actually introspect and look. What you're actually saying is, in fact, my past thinking is such that things like this current situation enough that that sort of feel enough like the past have been in my interest, and therefore they're in my interest now, right? That's actually what the way your value system biologically works is based on what you've chosen to pursue and what you think, implicitly think, even if you never say in words, is actually what your life ought to be. And so what you're actually saying is, it's good because I previously thought it was good. If you say I felt like it, I feel like it feels good. Now, it's also true, and this is where it gets complicated. It's also true that for a healthy, like one psychological need of man is to experience pleasure, and that's pleasure in the general sense, not just in the sort of this tastes good sense, but of like to experience positive emotions is a psychological need, right? And in general, to experience a functioning automatized value system, right? To have that, it's valuable to have that, and it's valuable to know that you have that. And so there is a value per se, to some extent, in things that you like because you like them, but that doesn't justify going after something just because you like it. That's just a sort of an additional thing of like, not only do I intellectually think this is going to add to my life, but also it's a thing that I already knew was good for me. And so I get the additional benefit of liking it, of desiring it up front and celebrating at the end, rather than the sort of drier, less full value of, okay, I knew this was right for me, but I didn't really feel it in the moment. So that is a complication that makes this view plausible, more plausible than I think it ultimately deserves. But ultimately, that's what I think you're saying is, so yes, as I said earlier, I think there are some generalized reasons to want to be around healthy living things, healthy, flourishing living things. And so it's understandable that if you just sort of think about, oh, yeah, there's these things on this other planet, I want to make them happy and healthy too, because I just like healthy and happy living things. That's an understandable first thing, but you can reify that feeling into so here we're going to get into a deeper epistemic point, and this is actually something I was thinking about beforehand. There's this I've reached a point where it's very clear to me often in philosophical disputes what the deeper epistemic or metaphysical dispute actually is, but I'm not yet very good at then making that back on the level that we're talking about. So I'm going to give this a shot, but we'll see. So okay. I think what you're ultimately doing there is you've identified a good. You've identified the good, And then what you're doing is you're detaching it from the context of your life. So like throughout your life, you've actually found real value in other living things, and in particular human beings. Let's ignore animal welfare, right? Let's say there was a human colony on Pluto, right? You have in fact found value and real value and legitimate value in other people being happy and flourishing and doing good work and just being in a benevolent world where people are successful in life, right? There's a real value in that. And then and then also you've found value in your own happiness and your own success, right? You've come to value that on some level or other. And then you take that conclusion and treat it as in a way that Rand calls intrinsic. So she has this trichotomy, intrinsicism, objectivism, subjectivism, which are basically three theories about the nature of knowledge. So this is broader than values, although it includes values. So the subjectivist view says basically knowledge and especially concepts are whatever we say they are. They're pure products of consciousness. We make them and we project them out into the world, and that's it. The intrinsicist view says no, there's essences out there, right? In my computer, there's an essence of computerness, and I have to abstract out the computerness from it. And then in good things, there's the essence of goodness, and that goodness just inheres in them, separate from me, separate from any intellectual context, separate from how I know it was good. It's just good. And ultimately, that's what I think the error is going on here, which is you're saying I know that my happiness is good, so I'm going to treat happiness disconnected from the context in which my happiness is good as good in and of itself. And I'm just going to maximize the happiness number out in the universe because my goal is to increase the goodness of the world, dropping the context of the entire concept of goodness and like both like logically as well as sort of in your own history when you're a child and learning that, developing that concept arises in the context of your own life, your own ends, your own goals, your own needs. And you detach it from that context and you're treating it as just like a thing separate from what makes it meaningful, from your means of grasping it. Does that make sense? Like that's...
Yeah, I think I understand the claim. Yeah, I would probably have to think more to kind of, or I would probably have to think longer than makes for a good podcast episode to go further on that. So I think it might be nice to move to kind of practical objectivist ethics, or especially in the domain of things that like seem like altruism. So, for instance, one thing that strikes me is, so you sent me some things to read, just to get roughly up to speed before we started. And they were produced by this thing called the Ayn Rand Institute, which is, if I remember, sorry?
Which is a nonprofit.
Yeah, it's a nonprofit. Like, my guess is that it like requires people to donate to it to survive. And the way I would analyze that situation is something like, look, you think like the Ayn Rand Institute is like roughly doing good stuff in the world, and like you can donate like $100 to them or something, and it's not gonna give you $100 worth of stuff, but it's gonna give like the world $100 worth of value or more than that, and so that makes you happy to donate to it. But I guess that's probably, well, I don't know if you personally donate to them, but okay. So how do you think about like whether that's actually rational for you to do or not?
Yeah. So, okay. I think the ARI is a complex case for a number of reasons. So Rand in general, before we get to the ARI specifically, her view on charity, which I've been convinced by somebody that that's probably the wrong word, that charity is too fundamentally a Christian view. And that a better word is, I think it was, generosity, and that in the sort of Aristotle has this view of the great souled man as like generous with his wealth and things like that as a part of it. So there's a view of you face the world and other men with general goodwill, like you want people to succeed. You want to be in a world where people are succeeding, and you understand that there are actually circumstances under which a good person, a valuable person, can find themselves down on their luck, right? where so this is so and again, ARI is not quite like this situation. This is more like your neighbor's house had a house fire, right?
Yep.
That sort of thing, and lost other stuff, and they've got insurance, but it doesn't really cover it, or things like that. And in that context, it's a marginal issue. It's not. So one big difference is this is not a major defining virtue of a person, whether they give this kind of charity or whether they're generous in this sense. It's a side issue. It's an expression of your overall, like, I guess you could talk like an abundance mindset towards the world, right? Everything is like, there's so much wealth, there's so much good, I'm overflowing, and I can just give a little and it would help so much. And it's not that you expect the person to directly pay you back, but you do marginally live in a world where people are better off. And like, when people are better off, they and so like, in contrast to the sort of Peter Singer view of expanding circles of concern, it makes complete sense and is completely rational that the people closer to you, whether in physical space or in value space, are people that you're more inclined to be generous toward, right? Because they're actually more in the world that you interact with. They're actually more part of the furniture of your life. So like, I benefit from, like, even if it's a neighbor that I don't talk too much, right? I benefit from my neighbor being wealthy, from my neighbor being happy, from my neighbor having the ability to do work he wants. I benefit from that in small ways, but in small direct ways, like their house is nice to look at, and when we pass each other on the street, it's a smiley, it's a friendly hello. And then in indirect ways, they are part of a market, they're part of a society, I'm part of, etc. So that's the sort of central case of charity. Now, the ARI is a little bit different, because I think it's basically a case of, and now I'm going to say failure, and I think failure is the wrong word because I'm not certain there is an alternative, but it's a failure to internalize the value they're producing. Like, the donations that I give to the ARI are things that I actually directly think will benefit my life. They just haven't figured out an economic model, and maybe there is no such economic model. I'm mixed on. I'm unsure on that, but they haven't figured out an economic model for them to capture that value, right? So, like, to me, why I donate to the ARI, their main program is an educational program teaching people, not necessarily objectivists, but people who are serious about Rand, more about objectivism, and not just objectivism, but other issues from a philosophical view. So like, I'm taking a course right now in their program on legal systems as an intellectual achievement. So like, we just did a reading on the Roman legal system and how it evolved and developed. And that's not part of objectivism, but the instructor is an objectivist and he's going to look at things from that lens and learn more. And so, like, to me, it's extraordinarily valuable to have people, especially given the current state of our universities and the humanities, to have people who are coming up, young people who are considering an intellectual career path, especially, but even in general, to have an intellectual grounding in topics of importance that doesn't smuggle in a bad philosophy, that includes a rational worldview in it. And then those people hopefully will go out and write and try to change the culture towards a better culture that I want. So it's less this sort of like just generous overflowing spirit and more like, no, there's something I specifically want. I want to live in a culture where objectivism is a primary driving force. I want to do that. I want that world to exist. And not just in the long term, but each incremental step in that direction is also a benefit to me. The more people there are at the end, there's an annual Objectivist conference that the ARI puts on. The more, not only more people, but the more people who actually know what they're talking about, right? A lot of the problem, and it's improved over the years, but a lot of the annoyance at these conferences is there are people, like, as in any intellectual movement, who just like to spout things off, who think they know everything, and they're living horrible lives. They're not actually following the philosophy. They don't know what they're talking about. And the more people, like, even if all this program did was made it so that the OCON had the same number of people, but they all actually knew the philosophy or knew what they didn't know, that would be a benefit. That would be useful to me. So that's what I'm paying for when I donate. I don't know. So part of the issue as well is the legal climate, right? There are significant benefits to, let's say, instead of donor, we could sort of say investor, right? There are significant benefits to being a 501c3. That's an Americanism. To being a charity that you can donate to, a nonprofit of a certain form, you can donate to and get tax benefits by donating to. as opposed to if they were offering a product of some kind that furthered the same mission, that would cost more. So there's a sort of political economic situation that pushes that. And then there's just like, I don't know, this is for reasons separate from my study of objectivism. This is a problem I've thought about a lot because I'm interested in better ways of doing scientific research. And my general question is, when somebody is producing a value, so with the generosity perspective, with the normal charity, what you're paying for is a sort of potential or sort of generalized sense of value. But no, if I'm donating to a scientific research institution, I'm paying for like an actual concrete value that I expect them to produce, even if that value won't directly redound to me. And the question is, when and under what circumstances is it impossible to capture that value in a normal market situation? And thus you're sort of have to go on a donation or similar model. Now, so maybe it's possible for them to be doing it differently. Maybe it's just a sort of economically suboptimal decision, but that is where they are, and they are producing that value, and nobody else is. So that's why I'm supporting it. It would be great if I could invest in it, right? If I was investing in them and they were somehow producing a profit as they were creating this result, right? That would be even better. Then that would feed itself in a much more effective way, and I would be more able to put more into it, et cetera. So it'd be better all around, but that's the current state. Does that answer the question?
Kind of. So I think there are two ways. So there are two things that you might have been saying that I want to distinguish between. So one is like, you could imagine like saying, look, ARI is like producing all this stuff that I value, and I feel like, it makes sense for me to kind of give them some money as if it were a market transaction because that would be fair or something.
Yeah.
And there's another version that's like, no, like ARI is doing a bunch of stuff, and with my money, like even if I weren't, or like something like, with my money, they can do a little bit more of that stuff, and I actually value that, as much as I value, more than I value like actually having that money myself. So
it's more the first one. There is an element for me, but not much, of the sort of general generosity view of, there's so much good stuff in Rand, and I just want more people to have it, right? There is an element of that. I wouldn't be donating as much as I did if that was all, right?
Okay.
A major part of my donation is like they are, and it's so you said like that would be a proper trade. Like I donate to Wikipedia because I use Wikipedia, and that's like I have regular donations that I think is sort of about what I think is appropriate for my usage. And it's a similar thing there, where like I benefit in the near term and in the long term. Like there's specific thing, like I am keeping my eye on the intellectuals coming out of this training program. Are they doing good work? Are they doing important things that I want? If they weren't, I would stop donating, right? Even if I thought the people's individual lives were better, if it weren't something that directly was I'm seeing it, I wouldn't donate as much as I do. So it's mostly the former of, they're doing work that I think is useful, that I want to do myself or indirectly, and I'm doing it indirectly, and I'm paying them to do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is a bit of a tangent, but can I try to convince you not to donate to Wikipedia?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. So here's my take. I think one of the most unfortunate aspects of this situation is that people think it is possible to donate to Wikipedia. It is not. There's an organization called Wikimedia. Wikipedia is one of their projects. Wikimedia uses money for like, hosting the servers, for running like Wikipedia conferences or whatever. Yeah. Like Wikipedia itself is a website. People edit it. They're not paid to do the editing. And like, as far as I can tell, if you look at like what Wikimedia spends marginal dollars on, like they've got more than enough for if I understand the situation correctly, they have more than enough for hosting, and like I get the sense that they are just not using marginal dollars particularly well.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so this is the problem of not being an actual market participant. If you have any resources on that, I'd love to read more.
This guy called Vipul Naik, so Vipulnaik, has written some stuff on the EA forum, the Effective Altruism forum, and maybe his personal website about why he thinks people shouldn't donate to Wikimedia.
All right, so Vipul Naik has a Wikipedia page on his website.
Yeah, so he's very interested in Wikipedia as a whole. Yeah, actually, somewhat related to the Objectivist ethos, he got in trouble on Wikipedia basically because he wanted to pay people to just edit articles that he thought were important. And it turns out Wikipedia hates it when you do that. It's technically legal on Wikipedia for you to be paid to do edits, but you have to disclose it everywhere, and you have to like submit your edits to non-paid people to approve, and
so there's, I mean, so Jimmy Wales considers, who's the founder of Wikipedia, he considers himself an objectivist. I don't know enough about him to know if that's true, but I find some aspects of the functioning of Wikipedia to belie that claim.
And to be fair, he doesn't, like my understanding is, I don't know, he set up a website and it's developed its own culture.
Right.
But
it's, I'll definitely consider that. I mean, it's sort of one of those things I set up, and I'm like, I check on it once a year. I'm like, I'm still using Wikipedia. It's still providing value, but I haven't actually. I mean, so this is one of the problems of a donation model, right? Like, if I'm buying something from Target, it's not important to me whether they're using those funds to like better get the inventory I bought to me, or whether they're wasting on something stupid because like I got the inventory I wanted. And so I don't, in general, markets are more effective, which is not a purely objectivist stance, but it definitely is informed by objectivism.
All right.
So I want to just to go back to the charity point. I think the really important thing is it's just not a major issue. It's not something that should drive your life. If you live an entire life and never donate to charity, you can have an amazing life. And your life, it doesn't make up for your other actions. So like choosing a job that you hate or that is actually destructive in order to make money to then donate it, like it doesn't cancel out like that. There's no like God doesn't have a ledger adding pluses and minuses and saying, this plus really, no, it doesn't work like that. But I also think that especially in a capitalist society where the kind of wealth that would occur in that world, I think there would be massive, and there were historically massive amounts of generosity, individual, organized of various forms. But one thing that it would include that is anathema today is explicit, you could call it means testing, but it's not really means testing. It's more like worthiness testing. Like there is such a thing as the deserving and undeserving poor. And as a donor, like if I were a donor to something that was specifically about helping poor people, it would be very important to me that it's filtered to just the deserving poor. Now, I know the typical arguments of like there are transaction costs to doing that, and at some margin, it's better to include a few undeserving. That's fine. I'm fine with that if you're on board with the core principle that there are people who do and don't deserve this generosity. And the goal is to give it to the people who deserve. And if we give it to people who don't deserve, that's only as a sort of side effect of transaction costs. And that's obviously a very different view than people typically take.
So this actually reminds me, so that there's this libertarian economist called Brian Kaplan, who I believe is working on this book about like which poor people deserve help, basically, which is, I think, one of the most shockingly, it does strike me as one of the most shockingly countercultural things you could kind of say. But so he has this rough analysis where he's like, if you're like in some developing country and like you can't really leave and there's, not great opportunities or, for you to enrich yourself, then like, then you're basically one of the deserving poor. But like if you're in some rich country where you could, if you tried, you could like make a good life for yourself, but you just like haven't bothered, then you're like not one of the deserving poor. I'm wondering, like, is that roughly your view?
That's basically true. I mean, with the caveat that unlike Brian, like in addition to the deserving, undeserving part, there's the impact on my life part, where the person who's in a developing country, even if they're sort of my evaluation of their moral character is wholly positive, they still matter less to me than the people next door, because they're far away, unless they're the kind of person who has the potential. And so here's another thing, right? Like the objectivist ethics, justice is one of the virtues of the objectivist ethics. And the priority is on the good and the healthy and the strong and the able. Those are the people who most deserve our praise and our attention and our trade and our admiration. Whereas the altruist ethics is ultimately rooted in victimhood, being weak, like being weak is the signal of virtue, is the signal of deservedness. So like, to the extent that the deserving poor are deserving, it's not because they're poor, it's because of the other things about them. And now that's not to say that poverty per se is proof of vice. Although I do think in the normal case, in a even semi-free country, it is. Like, I do think like somebody who's 40 and in America, not, raised by horrible people who completely crippled his life, living from paycheck to paycheck, constantly going broke, on the verge of homelessness nonstop. Like, I think that is a result of vice. But so that, I mean, the fundamental thing. But yes, what you're pointing out, like what Brian is pointing to, gets in the direction, I would say, of the objectivist evaluation. But again, like, I think the fundamental focus on their poverty is the thing that would be rejected, right? The most important thing for me is I want the best people to be freer, to have more resources, and ideally I would profit off of that. But ideally I would invest in them. But sometimes you can't. Sometimes there are brilliant kids who are trapped in a shithole town that they can't get out of themselves, at least for a couple of years. And if I can help support them now, but those are the people I really care about. I want them to be able to succeed and thrive and do great things and be producing in a world that I exist in and share with them.
Okay. Yeah. So I think at this juncture, I'd like to move a bit from ethics to epistemology, or worldview in general.
Can I say one more thing then on ethics?
Before? Oh yeah, say one more thing.
Yeah. So you talked about sort of like, I feel like it, like I find that I prefer these things being good in the utilitarian ethos, right? And I also later talked about charity as a very Christian concept. And Rand's view, and which I think is right, is that these sort of modern secular morality, all of these moralities are, first of all, they're not actually complete ethical systems. They don't actually have a rational basis for their views. And what they actually are secularizations of religious views. They're not scientific attempts to form a science of value and of a principle of virtue. They are instead taking your pre-existing religious beliefs that you were taught growing up, of like, you have this built-in sense of like, even if you weren't raised religious, if you're in her view, is if you're raised in modern Western culture, you were raised with religious values. And even if you later rationalize them in a secular code, you're still adopting it. So like this view, the fact that you find yourself valuing giving to others is not a coincidence, nor is it biologically inbuilt, like some sort of evolutionary psychologist approaches say that it's just a fact about human nature. It's not. There have been other cultures, like, and one exemplary one I think is ancient Greece. If you look at their ethics, they didn't have, so like, is Aristotle or even Plato's ethical view, is it altruistic or egoistic? They didn't have that distinction because there was no real altruism in the modern sense and in the Christian sense, especially at the time. So they weren't making that distinction. But I think if you take an honest look at like the Nicomachean ethics on its own terms, it's very clearly primarily an egoistic ethics. And if you look at the Greek worldview, like not their philosophy, but the way they lived, like their values were fundamentally rooted in their own flourishing, their own eudaimonia, etc. And like, so it's not the case that it's sort of a built-in human drive to value others.
And briefly, when you're in the context of like, you're saying, this is a offshoot of Christianity, like Rand basically rejects Christianity and religion, right?
Oh yeah, completely. Yeah, right. Yes, yes, completely. Like, so the view is, and Nietzsche has something along these lines as well, though he doesn't, his response is just pure subjectivism or rationalism. But that the things you say are good, even though you try to sort of frame them in this secular view, are just the Sermon on the Mount, right? It's just Jesus saying, give to the poor, give to the needy, the meek shall inherit the earth. And in fact, the entire valuation of Jesus, his crowning virtue was his incredible sacrifice. This is supposedly the best man, the most perfect human that ever was and ever will be. And his greatest achievement was giving all of that up, destroying all that for others. And Rand's view is that there's no actual secular way to justify that, and that the secular worldviews that try to justify that, basically what they have is, and she didn't put it this way, I have a friend who puts it this way, it's like, mommy taught me growing up this was good, I feel this is good, so I'm going to do it, and I'm going to find a way to treat that as a sort of systematic pseudo-scientific view, but it's ultimately just a secularization. And in general, she has a view of a lot of modern secular philosophy outside of just ethics is a shallow secularization of the religious philosophy that predated it, and especially the Christian one. So just wanted to tie together the things we were saying. But.
Sure. Okay. Cool. So yeah, I now want to move on to the epistemology. And in particular, I think so I've been heavily influenced by this website Less Wrong and the writings of this guy called Eliezer Yudkowsky, and I guess I actually don't have a good sense of the audience for this podcast, but I guess a lot of the audience is probably also very influenced by that.
Yeah.
Where it's something that there is this real reality out there. You can perceive it. You can make judgments about it, and there are correct ways to update your beliefs about that reality. I'm wondering, which sounds kind of similar to what I've read about objectivist epistemology and metaphysics. It's a bit more emphasis on probabilism and Bayesian reasoning and something. I'm wondering, can you lay out kind of how objectivist epistemology works, especially perhaps in contrast to this kind of less wrongy?
Yeah. So the one thing I want to start with, and this is in part why I found Less Wrong fascinating over the years, I found it after reading Rand, is that there is this similarity that you're talking about, right? That we can know things. Yeah, we can use our minds, and there's a methodology, and we need to learn that methodology and figure things out, and it ultimately has to be based in our sense perceptions, etc. But the problem is it's ultimately unphilosophical and unjustifiable. And for basically my analysis is that, and it's a more modern take on it, but it's basically the same thing. To the extent that there is a rationalist epistemology, as opposed to many different ones, right? To think that there is one, it's essentially the kind of view that Hume destroys in his philosophical skepticism. Now, I think Hume is wrong that there is no way out, but I think he's right that it's ultimately untenable. And so I think basically in broad strokes, right, that there is those things I was saying earlier, those are true, right? And there's a virtue in the rationalists clinging to that. But I think in one way we can look at the problem is evident in the name, Less Wrong, right? The entire ethos is, okay, we can't really know reality. We can't really be certain. If you actually take what they're saying seriously, if you take this probabilistic worldview seriously, it ultimately is skepticism. And you can't sort of paper over the skepticism by saying, oh yeah, well, we can get to 99.999%, because it's ultimately based on, we don't actually have contact with reality. We don't actually know the world. And so, and I think it starts at the level of, so the perception and volition. So this is sort of pre-epistemic. These are metaphysical issues in Objectivism, but Leonard Peikoff calls this the anteroom of epistemology. The issue of sense perception and volition, which is basically, in sense perception, the objectivist view, which I can elaborate if you're curious, because this is a very controversial claim philosophically, is that sense perception is valid. You see the world. You do not see things inside your head. So objectivism challenges most of the traditional sort of categorizations of philosophical views. So I'm going to use the term direct realist with some qualifications that if you are a philosophy student, you're going to bring in connotations that I don't think actually apply to objectivism's view, but it is a direct realist view. It's not naive realism, and if you know what that is, but it's direct realist. We actually see the world. I don't see the picture on the back of my eye that is formed by this watch. I'm holding up my watch to the people who are just listening to the audio. I'm holding up my watch and I'm looking at it. I see the watch. And there are all sorts of challenges coming up of okay, what about the relativity of perception, right? What about somebody who's colorblind or somebody who has been wearing tinted glasses, right? They see it in different forms. And there are answers to that, and I can get into that if you want. But the basic idea is, no, we directly see reality. I can know that there's a watch here. I know that I know that it's black. It's got a black face and it's got a brown strap. I know that directly via perception. And that's the perception itself is, I mean, to say infallible is infallible, I guess is the best sense. It's not subject to question in the way that conceptual conclusions are. So that's the first thing that I think ultimately rationalist epistemology rejects, right? The most common perspective I've seen in rationalism, and it's actually, I owe Scott Alexander a tweet reply because I challenged some of his posts and then he responded. And so I've been recently thinking about his views on this, but he's, I think he's representative in this respect, is that perception is some kind of indirect grasp of reality. What we actually know is our probability estimate of what the world is going to be like, or what we actually know is some representation in our head. We have a model of reality in our head, and that's what we know directly. And then there's the second later challenge of, okay, well, how does that model match up to the actual world? And I think basically what Hume and then later Kant show is that you can't get past that. If you start in your head, you can't get out of it philosophically. And what the actual proper philosophical view is, no, first we know reality. It's only later that we know our own mind, right? First, I know that there's a watch here. It's only later on seeing many things that I come to realize that I am seeing the watch. So contra Descartes, it's not the most certain thing is external. I mean, it's sort of silly to talk about more degrees of certainty in this respect. But at least the first known thing is external reality. It's only later known, and in a certain sense more difficult to grasp, is the fact that we are conscious of reality and the nature of that awareness as something distinct from the reality we perceive. So anyway, that's the first contrast, is that that perception gives us reality. We are directly aware of it. Now we can talk about that, or I can go to the second contrast.
Let's first talk a bit about the second contrast, and then we can
so the
decide
second
what to dive
contrast
in.
is, and this is less central in modern rationalism, but it's certainly historically been important, and it goes back to the overcoming bias stage of the movement, which is that rationalism, like a lot of modern sort of, can't remember what's blanking on the term, the behavioral economics influenced psychological view, is that human beings are inherently irrational, and we all have built-in biases, and sort of we can try to understand them and work within them, and there's things we can do to mitigate them, but ultimately we're biased. Ultimately we just can't, and like what that actually amounts to, even if they don't admit it, is that we can't know reality. We are not in control of our minds. We are not able to choose to know the world and to act on it. And it's ultimately a sort of self-defeating stance, but I don't want to make that philosophical case unless that's interesting to you. But the important point is that objectivism says, no, you can choose to use your mind or not. And importantly, so objectivism, the name, is based on Rand's notion of objectivity, which is, so her view of rationality is to use your mind to the best of your ability, to as best you know, to know reality. Objectivity is a more sophisticated concept. It's not only that, but you're using your mind according to a self-conscious methodological process. You've reached a level of sophistication where you're aware not only that you have to use your mind, but there's a specific processes you have to use. And if you use them, you can come to know reality, and you can also iterate on those processes themselves. So there's such a field as logic, right? That is a part, like the fact that there is such a field as logic is logic is the method of identification that man should use to guide his thinking. And so to volitionally say, I'm going to choose to self-consciously apply logic in all of my thinking, is to be objective. The reason I'm making that distinction is that any person can be rational, because rationality is effectively amounts to doing your best with what you know. But there's a certain level of sophistication you need to reach objectivity. You need to know that there is such a thing as a method of thought, and that method of thought is learnable and improvable upon, and then that you have to apply it. Now, once you do know that, to be rational is to be objective. Once you know that that's there, then you have to do your best is to apply this method. Anyway, so in the context of free will, the important point is you can in fact choose to do that. You can in fact choose to use your mind. You can in fact choose to be guided by reality and not anything else. And that if you are objective, if you use what is currently known about logic, and then maybe you have to expand upon it, maybe you'll encounter issues, maybe you'll find, oh, there's a new way that nobody knew about before, nobody explicitly identified, of going wrong that I have to be aware of, right? That's true. So like there is such a thing, like studying human bias is a valuable study, but not as a basic inescapable way that humans have to behave, but no, as a way of like, oh, I need to organize my thinking methodology to not fall into this trap. And usually they would come along with, let's reframe it positively. Like, what is the positive that this negative is missing? But even setting that aside, right? Okay, so there's such a thing as confirmation bias. In learning that there is such a thing as confirmation bias, I am able to work to develop a methodology that will ensure that I don't fall into confirmation bias. And so I'm actually able to be objective. I'm able to take this knowledge into account. And now objectivity doesn't guarantee, it doesn't mean that I'll automatically never make errors, but it makes not making errors possible. It makes it possible to achieve certain knowledge that is true and correct and not fallacious. And moreover, if you're being objective and you make an error, you will thereby, in so doing, have a lead to the problem in your methodology or the mistake that you made, because you had a self-conscious methodology. It didn't go right. And you can then look at, where did it not go right? Did I make a mistake according to my own lights? Maybe I just was, adding up numbers and forgot to carry a 1. Okay, fine. Then I should just, maybe put in a double check on my arithmetic. Or maybe no, there's this new kind of thing. Oh, I didn't know about confirmation bias. Nobody knew about confirmation bias. Now I need to incorporate this in. Okay, that's fine. That's not a fundamentally like the way behavioral economics treats it and the way rationalism treats it. It's like, no, this is just a way you are. You can't escape it. Human mind is suboptimal. You can account for it and we can reason about it. And there's a certain self-contradiction there. But you ultimately can't escape it. And the best you can do is try to be less wrong. And so I think that is a sort of those are the two pre-epistemic issues. And I got into a little into epistemology, but the pre-epistemic issues that you actually have free will. You are not subject to your environment or to your genetics. You can actually make choices and choose how you're going to think and whether you're going to think.
Yeah. I think I first want to touch on the second one because I think it'll be a bit briefer. And I want to defend the rationalist perspective a bit. Rationalism being like broadly a term for the less wrong style of thinking.
Right. Not
I'm sometimes a little
philosophical view.
Yeah. I'm sometimes a little bit hesitant to like claim that the whole word rational for this one website, but so I don't know. I think of the like less wrongy view of biases as like, because of like, I don't know, various ways that mind's evolved, like your mind is like basically your brain, and it's like, or it's the operation of your brain. Your brain is put together in a certain way, like by default, like you're born and, you probably have something like confirmation bias or something. And this is just going to be like, I don't know, a habit or an instinct or like the default way you do stuff when you're not being careful. But in fact, you can like try and do better because there are like correct ways to reason. And like, if you're not being careful, then like maybe you're probably going to do confirmation bias a lot. But I think of the less wrongy perspective as saying like, yeah, actually you could just like stop being biased if you like really tried. Maybe it's like actually just too hard. But I don't know. I'm wondering what you think of that.
So I think among the better people, that's what they're doing. But I think if you actually take Eliezer's writing on its face, and again, and so like people may think I'm making too big of a deal of this, but I think that the fact that you name it less wrong indicates what I'm saying, right? Not more right, not let's achieve, like we're trying to be less wrong. And this is a common view, a common saying. And I think these sort of like catchphrases, and Rand has this view as well, that the catchphrases people rely on often are indicators of deep philosophical views. And this view that all models are wrong, but some are useful, right? That's a very common rationalist saying, right? And again, there's this, that's basically saying, no, we can't know reality. There's a sort of pragmatism, like we can try to do as best we can. And again, there's this self-defeating nature. How can you know what's best if you don't know reality? But fine, let's set that aside. What you're saying is you can't have a true model of the world. You can't, and I don't use the term model, like, so let me put it in my language. you can't have a true theory of the world. And you'll often see pointing to like, look, Newton was better than what came before, but he was wrong. Einstein is better than Newton, but he's still wrong. And my view is no, Newton was right within a certain context. And there's Objectivism has a whole view of the contextual nature of conceptual knowledge that we could get into. But Newtonian mechanics is true within the context in which it applies. It is in fact fully true. It is not an approximation. It is not a partial truth. Einstein adds more information. He does progress knowledge forward, but he progresses knowledge. He doesn't destroy old knowledge and put new ones in its place. And I think the fact that this kind of thing keeps coming up points to what I'm not to my claim, which is that no, like ultimately the only way to sort of the philosophically integrated view and which is not fully integrated because I don't think it's fully consistent. You can make it consistent, but the more integrated view is no, you can't actually know the world. You can, and again, the fact that everything is done Bayesian, everything is about what is my belief, and there's an additional point of that, like the prior is sort of treated as a psychological construct, not as like it's not a state of awareness really. It's more just like the number is what it is, and what we can say about reason is the right ways to change the number. But the prior is what it is in a certain sense, and it's not it doesn't matter how you got it; it just matters how you update it. So there's a lot that goes wrong in it. But in particular, the important thing right now is that what it is a probability. And if you actually took it seriously and applied probabilities to everything, you would have to apply probabilities to Bayes' theorem, right? I hold with a 99.99% chance that Bayes' theorem is the right way to update my prior, or that even you have to also apply it to your conceptualization itself. That 99.99% chance that priors and posteriors is a rational way to think about the phenomenon of changing knowledge, right? There's all sorts of things that ultimately what it reduces to is you don't actually know anything. And then the last piece I want to say is that this view that you're sort of always going to face it, I don't think is true. And this gets into sort of Rand's view of the subconscious is what you're born with is not instincts, is not sort of automatic ways of thinking, but you have certain capabilities. And among those capabilities is an ability to automatize the modes of thought that you actually practice. So it is true, you said by default. It is true by default, if by default you mean default on the use of your mind. It is true that you will fall into certain noticeable patterns. The greater degree that you default on the use of the mind, the more that you'll fall into these patterns. That's true. And it's also true that inherent in the nature of human cognition and the limits of like the nature of the human mind, there are certain kinds of mistakes that will be easier to make if you're not aware of them. But it doesn't follow that you can't automatize a better process. Not only that you can't willfully choose to avoid it, but that having done so, you can actually automatize not making those errors and not finding them at all compelling. Not finding them something that even if you did drop the reins, if you've thought rationally your whole life and then you're 60 and then you sort of say, you give up on thinking, that's going to cause problems. But the problems it's going to cause are not going to be the sort of stereotypical basic biases that everybody falls into because you've never thought that way. You've never trained your mind to do that automatically. So that's not where your attention is going to go, even if you're sort of not grasping the wheel and going. So those are the things I would dispute in what you said.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So at this juncture, I think it might be helpful to go into how much stuff can people know? Like, can you be certain about things? Do you directly perceive reality? Before that, I want to just clarify, at least in my version of less wrongism, you can actually reason about what priors are better, and you can update them. And this is sort of related to the writing about how Solomonov's prior is super great on less wrong. It's because they think maybe you should be more like that. But that's something of a minor point.
Well, I think it illustrates something interesting, which is that Solomonov induction is, by everyone's admission, literally impossible.
Yep.
And you're holding up as your standard something that is unachievable, and that's ultimately a supernaturalist, mystical view that is being smuggled in. And again, I'm not able to fully support that claim, but that is my claim that to have a standard of perfection, which is literally impossible, is to divorce your standard from its purpose. The purpose of a standard is to evaluate your actions. And if you can't actually achieve your end, then it's an illegitimate end.
Sure.
So
I think,
anyway, that's
yeah.
an aside from your side.
Yeah. To me, I think this is sort of related to, like, I think the best version of less wrong would be like, yeah, that's true. It's true that it's kind of messed up that like Solomon-Off induction is our primary standard, and like in fact we think we're not totally right about epistemology yet, but we think that this is like roughly the right kind of way to go, or there are definitely right things about this.
I mean, if that's actually acknowledged by the people thinking about this, then that's a much better stance.
Yeah. So I think like, I don't know, for instance, like you do see like, I think the new cool thing on Less Wrong is to like not quite be a Bayesian anymore, for instance. So there's like, yeah, there is some movement there. But I want to get to the kind of, yeah, talking about like, just do we like directly perceive reality? Can we like actually know stuff? Or can we actually be certain about stuff? So I think like the default view that, or the view that like I would kind of normally hold is like the mind is basically some kind of computer program. Or the brain is like basically computer hardware running some program. And like if I think about how that's going to work, you know, it has like there's some like I want to say percepts. I'm aware this has like a very specific meaning in like objectivism, but you know, it like gets some information in from the environment through some sensors, and like, you know, it holds some like internal representation of like what's going on in computer memory, and like, you know, makes some, you know, decides what to do based on that and acts. And I think from this kind of picture, you kind of get some view of like, okay, well, like in some sense we directly perceive reality. In some sense, maybe what's like promoted to consciousness is like a like a pre-processed sense of our percepts, which like might not be like totally faithful. And like we only perceive so much, and so we have to like make inferences about the rest, and those inferences should be like probabilistic because we don't always have like sufficient information to kind of know everything about everything. But we might have some information to make better guesses, you know. I'm wondering, maybe the most productive way to understand objectivist epistemology is like, what's wrong with that kind of view?
Yeah. So there's a lot that isn't, I think, fruitful to say about that. So the first thing is just to draw a connection. As I said earlier, the thing that Hume rejected and that Kant, I think, destroyed is this representationalism, is this idea that what you're given is a representation of the world outside of you, you're not given the world directly. And then there's another thing that you said that I think was really indicative of the fundamental error here, and the error in Rand's view, and I'm not enough of a student of philosophy to know if this is true, but she held this basically of all modern philosophy. The basic error is, you say what's given to us is somehow processed in some way. It's not, we don't get everything, we don't get it raw, as it were, and therefore it's distorted. And what Rand sees that as ultimately saying is that what you're saying is that because consciousness works in some particular way, therefore it's invalid. Because, and to connect it to her deeper metaphysics, because consciousness has identity, it's not conscious. And that the only actual consciousness would be not God's consciousness, because that would still operate through some means, but a non-consciousness, something that is nothing in particular, something that operates by no specific means, sort of like ESP and direct revelation from the universe with no process, no mechanism. That's what would be. Now, I'm not saying you fully endorse that.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's like invalid, therefore. I just think like that's the thing going on.
Right. So it's true. Yeah. It is important. Now, and so Rand says, no, the exact opposite. Consciousness has identity. That's how it has to have identity, has to do something, and that's why it can work. You do see things in a certain form. So a major, and I want to get to something else you said, but I want to talk about this first. A major concept in the objectivist metaphysics, again, this is sort of in the bridge between metaphysics and epistemology, is the form-object distinction. We are aware of reality in a form. So
Hmm.
I see my watch, and what I'm seeing is my watch, but I am seeing my watch. It's a visual form of awareness of my watch, but I'm not seeing the awareness, right?
Yep.
So I'm also holding my watch. I'm feeling my watch. Those are both awarenesses of the watch, the seeing and the feeling, and they're integrated in my actual conscious experience. But if I close my eyes, I still feel the watch, but I can't see it. So my awareness has changed, but the watch hasn't changed. And if I drop the watch and close my eyes, I neither see or feel it, but I remember it. So I'm still aware of the watch, but in a different form. So there are different ways of being aware of things. And the specific natures of our forms of awareness are important to understand and play a role. But it doesn't actually undermine the fact, and in fact, the opposite, that we are in fact aware of the watch. I'm not aware of my feeling of the watch. I'm aware of, I am feeling the watch. I'm aware of the watch. I'm not aware of my seeing the watch. I am seeing the watch. And then I can then later introspect and say, oh, I was seeing the watch. That's how I knew it. But what I'm seeing now is the watch. Does that make sense? That distinction? I can get into more there, but that's the basic objectivist answer to that issue, as well as to the sort of general questions of like perceptual relativity. People see things in different forms. Yeah, okay, they see them in different forms. That doesn't mean they're not seeing them, and it doesn't mean that seeing isn't a grasp of them. Now, it's true that as you sort of get more sophisticated in your knowledge, you learn that, okay, I have to separate out the form from the object conceptually. Now, by separate out conceptually, what I mean is any given perception, any given awareness is awareness in some form. So there's no actual separation in reality of form and object. Like the object exists independent of awareness, but if we're aware of it, we are aware of it in some form. We are the what and the how is often how it's talked about. We're aware of things somehow. And sometimes in order to interpret is a bad word, to reason properly from your perception, at some level of sophistication, it becomes important to learn to separate out the form from the object. But that is in fact something we can do. I was just doing it earlier, right? I was saying, look, I see it and now I don't see it because I've closed my eyes, but it's still there. The thing that stays the same is the watch is still there. The thing that changes is my sight of it. Or if I lower the light enough that I can't discriminate colors, it's still black. Like the watch face is still black, but I can't see that anymore. I only know it because I remember it or because I know the materials it's made out of. So my awareness of its blackness changes, but I'm still aware of it. I still know it's black. It would be wrong for me to say it's gray because I can't distinguish the colors. I would say it looks similar to the way gray things look in this light, but that's okay. That's not a challenge. That's not a challenge to knowledge. So that's that point. And then the third point I want to make, and then you can follow up, is your basic starting point of the brain as a computer is a complete denial of consciousness, and ultimately a great instance of what Rand called the stolen concept fallacy, which is, her view of knowledge is that it's hierarchical, and that some of our more sophisticated advanced concepts are built upon and only have meaning in the context of earlier concepts. And so the stolen concept fallacy is where you use a later concept in the process of denying an earlier one. So the concept of computer and the concept of information in the sense of computers is derivative of the concept of awareness and computation in the human sense of I'm actually aware of the world. I'm actually, and information is things that give me awareness of the world. Like I don't have a great definition of information, but it'd be something like, the primary definition of information is something like facts about something external to me, such that I'm able to grasp something important based on that fact. I don't know exactly. I don't have a great definition, but like it's something about a relation to consciousness. And now you're saying, no, there's no consciousness. There's just computers executing algorithms. First of all, which are deterministic, but second of all, which aren't aware. And that's more fundamental than the determinism, because it's also not true of animals. Even, so objectivism and this isn't a hard and fast principle. If you came up with, if we scientifically could prove that some animals had some proto-volition, that wouldn't like destroy objectivism. So we don't have to bank on that. But the basic view is, animals are not volitional. Volition comes in at the conceptual level, but they're still aware. They're automatic, but they're not mindless machines. They're not mindless. They're not consciousnessless machines. And that whole starting point throws away the game. it basically says we're not aware of anything, and that's a contradiction in terms, and that you can't get anywhere from that. If you're not aware of anything, you're not aware of anything. There's an objectivist philosopher, Harry Binswanger, who puts it: computers, literally speaking, don't compute. Computers just change voltages, shift, have shift voltages around, or however you want to. I mean, there's a more sophisticated view of like what's going on electronically. Humans use computers in order to compute, if we are being precise. Humans use the physical organization of a computer, and in particular use software that is a human view of the physical arrangement of bits in RAM or whatever, which again, bits even is a human view of like actual voltage differences in pieces of RAM or whatever. Humans use that as a means of computing or determining what they want to know. But the computer itself is not computing. It's just, and computing in this sense, in the philosophical sense, is a process of consciousness. So I just threw a lot at you. Curious what's helpful there.
Yeah, I think there are two rabbit holes we could go down. So the first is like fleshing out the kind of like what follows. Like suppose so I have this water bottle right here.
Yeah.
And I could say like, yep, I'm perceiving the water bottle. I'm not perceiving my perception of the water bottle or the shadow of it on my eyes or something. I'm perceiving the water bottle. And I get the sense that like you derive a lot from that, where I'm like, I don't know, we could like, I'm kind of willing to like, depending on how we're using the word perceive exactly, I'm kind of willing to go either way on how we talk about that. And then I want to know, okay, but like, what do I actually know about the water bottle, or could I be mistaken, or stuff like that?
Yeah. So let's talk about could I be mistaken? And this is not unique to Rand. This goes back to Aristotle, but the view of like mistaken perception. So this ancient skeptic argumentation goes things like, okay, you see a stick in water and it looks like a bent stick, but it's actually a straight stick. Now, I find that example kind of odd because I don't think anybody would actually make that mistake. Like there are actual mistakes of illusion and perceptual confusion, but not that one. But the basic answer is that let me take an example that I think is a little bit more plausible. Okay, here's an example. Something that actually happens, right? You see someone in a crowd. It looks like your friend.
Yep.
Right? And let's say you're a kid. Or it looks like your mom. You go up to them and you say, hi, mom. And then, oh my God, it's not my mom. Right? What happened there? Now, the objectivist view, which I think goes back to Aristotle, is that wasn't a mistake in perception. That was a mistake in your conceptual use and processing, or lack thereof, of the perception. Now, maybe it's an inevitable mistake, but that person does in fact look like your mom, right? Like what it means to look like something is to be so constituted as to interact with your visual system such that you will appear similar, right? That the form in which I see that person is similar in certain ways to the form in which I see my mom. But then later perception, so the perception was valid. That person does in fact look like my mom from that angle. And then the inference that it is in fact my mom turned out to be wrong. But I can then later correct that and say, okay, well, now I've learned that under certain perceptual conditions, my identification of a person as being the person I thought it was depends on more than just a single perceptual similarity. And I have to either rely on more of their features, either explicitly or more likely automatize more of my like facial recognition. Okay, well, this person looked like my mom. Oh, wait, her hair's a little different. That's not my mom, right? Or say, okay, well, I can guess from afar that it might be my mom, but I'm going to go up under the assumption that it might be and not that it is, and then verify more as I get closer. And like, oh, it doesn't actually look like her, or she says something different. All of that ultimately relies on perception being valid, being a valid grasp of I'm actually seeing this person in front of me. It just turns out that my conceptual identification was wrong. And the means of correcting that is perceptual. The means of correcting that error is, later perceptions turn out to not integrate with that, right? So like my mom has a voice like this and this person has a different voice. So that doesn't integrate with my other knowledge of my mom that I had. So this looks like my mom, but doesn't sound like my mom. That means she's different from my mom. And so I know things about this woman, right? I know things about this person I saw. And it's not just that I know what she looks like. but that's one of the things that I know now. I know she looks like my mom, and that is a fact about her. But it's also a fact about her that she has brown hair. Now, it turns out maybe later in a different lighting situation, it might look like she has brown hair, but she doesn't. That's another thing I learned about my means of perception. But still, under normal lighting conditions, I can in fact conclude she has brown hair. And the very concept of brown, it's not a concept of, so the mistake that people make is that brown is a fact about your perception. And no, my view, and actually this is somewhat contentious amongst objectivists, but I think this is the only way to actually interpret Rand's view, is brownness is a property of objects. It is one that is especially salient to people because of vision, like because of the way the human visual system works. So like something like heaviness, you could have a very different perceptual system, but you would expect any species with a mind to have a concept of heaviness. But you could imagine a species with a mind with a very different visual system or no visual system at all that doesn't have a concept of brownness until they interact with humans and realize that humans have a visual system of a certain kind. So there's something interesting about color there. But it still is the case that things are brown or not. And they can look brown or not too. And those are different facts. So the way I'm first in contact with brownness is that it looks brown. But then I can learn facts like, what is it about the thing that makes it look brown? I can learn things about that over time. And what I'm learning about is brownness, not about the way things look. And so if I'm holding my watch and I know my watch is brown and it's dark, and then I hold something else and I was like, oh, that's brown too, because it looks the same. And then I turn the light on, and, oh, it's not. Okay. So I've learned something new about the way brown things look under certain lighting conditions. It's still brown or not. So I'm still perceiving facts. I'm able to infer that. It's just not automatic. The way I conceptualize it is not automatically correct. And that's where things can go wrong. But the important point is you still have recourse to perception. The perception is still of reality. You still are directly contacting it. And your entire conceptualization is ultimately rooted in that perception. So you update your conceptual process by reference to the later perception.
Okay. Yeah, I think this gives people a sense of like the kind of objectivist take on things. I could, in a different podcast, I might argue about how much that's different from like a less wrongy view, but I think that's not what I'm totally going for. Yeah. So instead, I might want to move to basically your critique of the computational theory of mind, where like you're like, oh, if I guess you said like it fundamentally denies consciousness, and like the only way we know about computers or whatever is like via our consciousness or something, and therefore it's kind of crazy to think that like to use the concept of computation to deny consciousness or whatever. Yes. First of all, why like suppose like your brain is like basically just doing computation. Why is that a denial of consciousness? That's just not clear to me at all.
So if what you're saying is the brain in toto, the sort of, when we're thinking about its relevance to human behavior. So I'll leave open the sort of epiphenomenalist view as in the same camp as the complete denial of consciousness view, where for what matters to human behavior, sorry, that was jargon that I should have explained or not dropped in. What matters for human behavior is the same kinds of things that matter to robot behavior when we look at the way robot circuitry functions, right? We know directly, and this is sort of from direct introspection, this is not provable because it's the foundation of proof. It's directly self-evident that our awareness guides our actions, right? One of the things like that, my seeing of my watch guides my reaching for it and putting it on my hand. And that if I didn't see my watch and I didn't feel my watch, I couldn't do that in the same way. Now, and we also have a directly given distinction. This is maybe a little bit less direct. It's maybe a little bit more inferential, but it's still pretty low level in terms of the cognitive hierarchy of like things that happen without us being aware of it and things that require awareness. So like as an adult, when I walk around, unless I put work into it, I'm not really aware of my walking, like of lifting my leg and putting it down and exactly how I'm positioning my foot and all of that. Like that's either completely out of awareness or so low level awareness that it's effectively out of awareness, right? But I'm still clearly responsive, right? There's clearly some kind of stimulus response going on in the walking, right? Even if it's, let's stipulate that it's not getting to conscious awareness. Getting to is terminology I don't fully endorse, but let's stipulate that you're not at all consciously aware of it unless you choose to be. There's still some mechanical automatic process going on in your nervous system. Maybe it doesn't reach your brain to regulate the walking, right?
Yep.
So there is a distinction there. And that distinction is given, right? Given to us introspectively, which is an aspect of perception in my view.
Sorry, the distinction between what and what?
Between action which is guided by consciousness and action which is not.
Okay,
right?
Got it.
Even if there is some sort of regulatory mechanism going on, that distinction is given, it's basic. And so to say that we are just like computers, well, a computer or a robot, let's say, doesn't have any awareness that is guiding its action going on. All that's happening is physical, mechanistic cause and effect of this voltage here goes to that voltage there, actuates this capacitor, this motor here, which then turns in this way, right? And those are just evidently different. So there's this, I'm not going to remember this well enough to make the point, so I'll drop that. But right. So this is the point. So in a lot of philosophical issues, like when people put forward a claim, one of the goal is to like reduce it to an absurdity. And there's something where it's almost given as an absurdity if you equate consciousness with some physical process. Like it's like if somebody comes in and says an elephant's a banana, how do you reduce that to absurdity? It's absurd on its face, which is not to say that like I'm trying to avoid the implication that I don't have an argument for it. It's more that it's just directly evident that like we look at like awareness has different properties than a mechanistic. So this is a sort of the traditional argument for, you call it dualism. I don't like that word for a lot of reasons, and the stance is associated with a lot of mysticism. But the basic idea that the consciousnesses are not reducible to material actions and vice versa. So the primary thing is the very concept of physical is formed in contrast to the mental, right? When we talk about the concept of physical, the way we get there epistemically, logically, the logical hierarchy is, okay, we're learning about the world. We learn that things have weights and they move in certain ways and they have speeds and that there are certain properties that all kind of relate to each other in this way. And then we learn about our own minds, our own functioning. And our sight has intensity and clarity, all these different properties that are not, and then we form these different concepts of mental and physical to say, okay, look, there's one set of properties that all are similar in certain ways. And I think the essential similarity is they're primarily arrived at through introspection. And then the physical properties are the ones primarily arrived at through extrospection. And then there are things that are sort of in between that are not purely mental or physical concepts, but mix both. So we have this conceptualization. And then what we're saying is, there's only physical. We're going to reduce the mental to the physical. We're going to deny the mental, which was the entire basis of forming the concept of physical in the first place. So that's the fundamental error that's going on here. But the way you can see it is, look, like, as I said, like, think my thought process has the property of clarity, right? So a thought process can be more or less clear. A thought process can be, my vision can be focused or broad, right? That's not true of physical processes. And it's only true of computers if we sort of smuggle in a human being using the computer in order to know something. We can only say that, like, okay, this sensor, to say that a sensor has a certain tolerance, to say that it's accurate within a certain range, is to say that if I, as a human being, were to use the output of this sensor as a measurement of something, then I could only specify that measurement within a certain range. Because the sensor just is what it is. It just responds to what it responds to, and it behaves in the ways it does. It doesn't have a grasp of anything. But to make that point, all I can refer you to is, look, notice the difference between looking at something and having a picture of something, but not looking at the picture, but just the picture existing, right? There's a difference there, right? Notice the difference between guiding your action by seeing it versus by remembering it. So those are both guided by consciousness, but they're different ways of actions guiding by consciousness versus a computer that is just guided by automatic physical reactions that are not ever aware. And you can't get underneath that. That is a basic conceptual distinction that is ultimately rooted in things that are given perceptually as distinct.
Okay. Oh man. So I'm having a bit of difficulty because there are like a bunch of things I disagree with there that we could dig in on, and I'm trying to decide which to go into to provide most clarity. I think maybe what I want to go into is so you mentioned this distinction between like, yeah, awareness has some like you can kind of distinguish awareness from non-awareness. So like if I'm walking and I'm not aware of like how I'm walking, like I can tell the difference between that and like doing something while being aware of like how I'm doing it. And like I'm wondering, like it seems to me that on some like computationalist view, like I could just say, yeah, I'm like, it's just a different computation. There are some computations that like aren't the computations of awareness. There are some that are, and like, I'm just doing the non-awareness ones sometimes, and I'm doing the awareness ones sometimes.
I'm going to make an epistemic point first, which is the burden of proof is on the computationalists to prove that, and they never have. They don't have any. The closest you get is something like integrated information theory, which all it can tell you is this kind of system is more or less conscious. It doesn't have any specific thing to say about like what the quality is. So the burden of proof is on the computationalist to say this particular kind of computation has these particular conscious qualities. But the more fundamental point is, even if someone could do that, my claim is that is, and I think there are reasons we can know it's false, but even if we didn't, that is saying something more about computation than we already know. It's an additional fact that, okay, when computations of a certain kind occur, there will also be this conscious experience ongoing. So even the epiphenomenalist, who I think is ultimately still denying consciousness. And again, here now I'm going to explain the jargon. Epiphenomenalism in philosophy of mind is the position that, yes, we have awareness, and that is something different than physical stuff, but the awareness is no causal efficacy. It's sort of a byproduct of physical processes that are ongoing. Even the epiphenomenalist still is saying something more than the pure materialist. Like it is not given. So one way to think about it, and I don't think this can go too far, but if we just said, okay, let's just look at the laws of physics as we currently know them and sort of churn through the kinds of things that the laws of physics would predict, or more, and I think more fundamentally, the kinds of things that the ontology of our current physical theories allow us to say. They don't allow us to say consciousness. They don't allow us to say awareness. They can allow us to, the ontology of physics allow us to describe a situation where there's a hand grasping a ball, right? You can say, okay, what I mean by a hand grasping a ball is, okay, this atom here and that atom there and that atom there is arranged and these are connected in this way and that's connected in that way and that's around, and that's what I mean by a grasp. But if you just redefine the awareness as this kind of computational state and not that kind, you're missing the actual fact that there are these qualities to consciousness that are not there. If, on the other hand, your claim is when such and such computational state obtains, there is also this additional conscious state going on. That's an additional claim that is not expressible in the ontology of current physical theories. That is not not expressible, so not even not predictable. I also think it's not predictable, but more fundamentally, you can't even describe a state in purely the terms of our current physical theories, or more generally, in terms of concepts we purely think of as physical. You cannot describe a state which is conscious unless you smuggle in your knowledge of what consciousness is outside of that ontology.
Okay. So when you say you can't describe this in physics, like in the ontology of current best theories of physics, like it seems to me that it's not always clear what you can and can't describe in like the ontology of physics. So you could imagine saying like, look, if I think of water, right? Like water, it's the substance, it's like it's wet, and like in the in the current ontology of physics, we think that there's like this molecule that has like one oxygen atom and two hydrogen atoms, and they're connected in a certain way. And like it's moving around in a way, and that's what water is.
Yeah.
But like, you know, water, like that's just expressing like one type of water. But for all I know, you know, there could be some other version of physics where we didn't have molecules, we had, you know, schmolecules or whatever. And like these schmolecules acted together and, you know, had all the wateriness properties.
Yeah.
And therefore, and so you can imagine someone saying, look, okay, because of that, like the thing physics was describing wasn't actually water, it was like H2O based water, but you know, that's not all that water is. But actually it is all that water is. And because it's just not obvious to you what the physical grounding of things can be.
I think there's two issues coming in here, and the first one is not directly on consciousness, but it's more about sort of the I don't know if you're familiar with the analytic synthetic dichotomy philosophy.
But our listeners might not.
Yes. Yeah. So the basic idea is that there's this division of truths into analytic truths and synthetic truths. And if analytic truths are things that sort of follow from the definition of the terms that you're using.
Yep.
So if you define, so an easy example is ice. Let's say if you define ice as the liquid state of a solid state of water, right? Then under the analytic synthetic dichotomy, you would say it's an analytic truth that ice is solid, right?
Yep.
That because we defined it as the solid state of water.
Yep.
But it's a synthetic truth. It's not given in the definition of the terms that ice is made up of H2O in a certain structure. And I think you were implicitly relying on this dichotomy in your example, because you're sort of saying, look, we define the concept of water as this liquidy stuff, right? Maybe we don't have a precise definition, but we have a sense of the conceptualization. Yep. And then we find that so far all of the water we found has this particular thing, but that's synthetic. That's not given. This distinction often comes along with the sort of necessary contingent truth of the technically different distinctions, but that like in all possible worlds is one way it would be put. Water would have to be wet, but there's a possible world in which water is made of X2O is an example often given. And the objectivism view is that is a complete false distinction from top to bottom, that definitions do not capture the entire meaning of the concept. They have a particular epistemic usage, but the referent of the concept is the things in reality as they actually are. There's no possible worlds. There's just the world that exists. The concept of possibility in the sense of could be otherwise only applies to human action or volitional action if there are other volitional beings. But for now, as in our current state of knowledge, it only applies to human action where things could have been otherwise. So if you were to talk about necessary versus contingent, you would say it's not necessary that the United States had 50 states, but there's no sense to the claim. It's not necessary that our solar system had 8 planets, right? That is a distinction that objectivism rejects. That's form of necessary versus contingent, and also similarly for related reasons, that the form of analytic synthetic. And the basic root of the distinction of objectivism stance is that no, the meaning of a concept is the reference, is the thing in reality. So we look at water, we interact with water, and we see that there is something similar between all these instances as opposed to other things that aren't water, right? So we have this. We have similarities against the background of difference, and objectivism has a fairly technical theory of what exactly is going on in how we go from perception to concepts. But it's an objective process, we can grasp it. And so we become aware of the reference of the things that we refer to by water in a certain form. And that awareness is based on certain knowledge. But if we later learn that all of that water was H2O, then that water is H2O. And that necessarily is H2O. And then if we later learn that there's something else that is similar to water in many respects, including the original perceptual respects, right? We originally found our concept of water based on perceptual properties. We now have expanded our knowledge of water, but it's all knowledge of water, and it's all in the same category, that it's made of H2O. If we later find a substance that's like water in many respects, but it has a different molecular structure, or isn't even made of molecules at all, it's made of molecules, right?
Yep.
Then there might be, depending on, and it's hypothetical, so we can't flesh this out in detail, but there might be an option here. Conceptually, we can decide, do we form our concept in a way such that water is the H2O stuff and we have a new concept for this new stuff? Or do we have new concepts, H2O water and non-H2O water? And there sometimes are options in that. Sometimes, most of the time there aren't. Most of the time when you reach this kind of issue, no, like the requirements, the facts that give rise to the need to conceptualize mandate one or the other answer. So for example, almost certainly molecule water would not quench your thirst. It might feel good, but it wouldn't actually like satisfy your biological need, right? Okay,
Yep.
so we shouldn't call it water. Just because our definition, and that means what we need to do is change our definition, not our concept. Our concept still refers to all the same things, including the things we haven't yet encountered, which are water. But we change our definition to, it's a thing with this properties, which is made up of H2O. Okay, fine, we've changed our definition. That's not a problem. That's definitions are contextual. They exist within a certain context of knowledge. The purpose of a definition is to distinguish your concept from all your other concepts within a given context. So if your context changes, it's fine if your definition needs to change. There's no problem there. But the concept itself stays the same. Sometimes you form a new concept. Sometimes you have to reject old concepts, but it happens much less frequently than these sort of philosophical problems suggest.
Okay.
So that's the first point. You can respond to that, or I can respond to the point on the implication you were trying to make with respect to consciousness.
Let's I think we should move forward. The thing before we move forward, the thing I wanted to say, I think it's possible that I spoke unclearly or you misunderstood me, but the implication I wanted to make was like, when you were saying like, we can't express something like consciousness in the language of physics, I'm skeptical that that's like something that you could know, or at least that you could easily know.
I'll give two positions on it. One is the epistemic point again. The burden of proof is on the person who claims that you can, and and so objectivism has a particular view on the burden of proof principle, that it's not just that like, oh, it's good sportsmanship in argument to do this. It's not. It's actually non-cognitive in objectivism's view to put forth a claim without evidence and in the absence of possibility of evidence and in defiance of evidence. What you're doing is masquerading as cognition, but there's no actual claim there. So the burden of proof principle says treat it as if nothing has been said. And objectivism's view is you do that because nothing has been said. So to say, yeah, somehow we can do it. Somehow we can express it. Like ultimately, there's no claim there. But there are some cases where you can actually make a negative claim. You can prove a negative claim. So I think you can do that. And basically, and this is going to get a little technical, but I think it's just for demonstration purposes ultimately. So Bohmian mechanics is a particular, and I promise I'm not going to make some quantum woo bullshit here. Like there's a reason I'm bringing this up. So Bohmian mechanics is a particular theory of quantum mechanics of the world at the quantum mechanical level that is consistent with the mathematical quantum formalism, and in particular consistent with our understanding of molecules, molecular structure, et cetera, and with pretty much, excluding nuances from quantum field theory, pretty much everything about physical known about the behavior of the world. And the reason I'm bringing up Bohmian mechanics is because its ontology is in a certain sense very simple, right? The basic things that exist is a particles and wave functions. And there's the wave function has a certain state and particles has a certain position. And all other properties are derivative of that, right? Charges and spins and all of that are properties of either the potential, the thing that impacts the motion of the particles or the evolution of the wave function. Everything. So this is a point about the ontology of physics, right? So it's a very simple ontology. And ultimately, what that means is all that, since Bohmian mechanics is sort of equally expressive to other quantum mechanical theories, if Bohmian mechanics can express something, neither can anything else. And all that Bohmian mechanics can actually express, ultimately, is the positions of stuff or the states of the wave function, which nobody's actually talking about when they're talking about macroscopic objects. They're not saying, okay, well, the wave function in this state versus that state, that's what thinking is, right? Nobody's actually saying that. So
I think I'm saying that, but let's continue. Maybe sensible people aren't saying that.
So if all you're saying is that the position of these particles, and then what a hand is a certain arrangement of particles that are in certain relations to each other, and then those relations are ultimately about position, ultimately about the position particles are in, and the forces between them, which are okay, fine. We can add in forces, which are just, again, things which are ultimately cash out in terms of their changes in position. My claim is that it is directly given that consciousness is not just a motion, is not just the position of things. Maybe it results from things being in a certain position. Maybe it causes things to be in a certain position. But the qualities of clarity is not like you. So like okay, let's say we say, okay, nobody's ever actually done the full reduction of, I've got this ball that spins on its top that I'm spinning on my hand, right? And nobody's done the full reduction down to the quantum mechanical level of how that spinning at the macroscopic level is actually can be seen as just the same thing as not a causal consequence of, but the same thing as these particles moving in certain ways, right? It's a certain motion of certain things, because it's just a big motion. A big motion composed of smaller motions is fine. There's nothing objectionable about that. So if somebody says in principle, this can be reduced to that, okay, I'd like to actually see them show their work, but I don't have this deep philosophical objection to that claim in the same way. But if somebody says in principle, your thoughts can be reduced to motion, I'm like, my thought isn't motion. It's a different kind of thing, right? It's just a category error, right? To see my watch is not to be in a certain position. Maybe it results from things being in a certain position. Maybe it causes things, but it is not the same thing as being in a certain position. Even a lot of things being in a certain position. It's awareness of things being in a certain position, and that's just directly given. And there's ultimately nothing more to say about it. And so I know that's going to be unsatisfying to people because they want to prove it. And ultimately my claim is consciousness is a prerequisite of proof. The concept of proof depends on, we have awareness, and for human beings, certain things that we have awareness of are not direct, but are indirect based on a process which can fail and go wrong. And so we need means of validating our process. And that's what proof is. So that the whole concept of proof depends on consciousness. So you can't prove it, but you can point to what you mean. And so I can point to you and say, this is what I'm talking about. And you either see the distinction or don't, ultimately.
Okay. So there's a lot to talk about there, but just to clarify your own view, like if consciousness isn't physical, by which I take it you mean, sorry, when you were bringing up Bohmian mechanics, is that because you think like that's actually how
my
quantum
point
mechanics works?
To bring it up was just because it has a very simple ontology. Yeah.
Okay, sure. So
matter in motion, let's say.
So if consciousness isn't like made out of physics stuff, which is to say it's made out of something like atoms or wave functions or quantum fields, like what is it, and why does it seem to have this like close relationship to the physical system that is my brain?
Okay, two things. The first thing is, you say made out of, like I'm saying consciousness is an entity. And I think this is the basic Cartesian error that he sees the issue I'm talking about. But he says, okay, there must be some mind stuff. No, consciousness is not a thing. It's not an entity. It's not a ball. It's not a spiritual ball. It's an action, a process. Consciousness is a thing we do. Now, it's not a material process. That I agree with. So it's the first philosophical point is it's not a material process. And it's true that it results from, in a certain sense, it's a consequence of certain material arrangements, right? Now, we don't know what the prerequisites are fully, but we know some of them. And the question of why is it that? Well, first of all, we can say, like, for it to be consciousness, it has to be, like, consciousness is inherently a biological concept. Consciousness, it's like inherently guiding action of a living being. Now, I don't want to go into the details of why I think that's the case, but I'm going to just state that that's my view. And so that we can say philosophically. The question scientifically of, like, how does that happen? Like, what are the laws? The question of under what circumstances, under what material arrangements will there be consciousness? I don't know. That's a scientific question. It's not a philosophical question. The vast majority of philosophy of mind is garbage. It should not be a philosophical subject. It's a scientific question. It's actually a question I'm very interested in solving myself scientifically, but not philosophically. Like that's a question of like, okay, let's study changes in brains and changes in consciousness and causal connections between those. And when I think in this way versus that way, what physical changes happen, and what can we say? What can we generally say about the relationship between those, and what relationships can we establish between those? So like that's just a normal, in a certain sense, it's a normal scientific question. The thing that's abnormal about it is that all of our successful science to date, and so I'm excluding most psychology from successful science, all of our successful science to date has started from the point of, we're going to abstract away from consciousness and look at just the physical. And so I think to solve this problem scientifically, a new approach to science is going to need to be taken. And I suspect, and this is not a philosophical claim, I suspect a big part of that change is going to have to be dropping the sort of reductionistic, let's break things up into spatially localized parts and analyze them separately and then compose them together. I suspect that a proper scientific understanding of consciousness will have to transcend that approach. But in general terms, this is a scientific question. What philosophy has to say is we are conscious. We are in fact conscious. Consciousness is in fact difference from matter. Consciousness is how we live. And this gets to a sort of more general point that Rand makes about her metaphysics, which is in one of her journals, she points that like a major task of philosophy is to eject cosmology from metaphysics. That the major error, she was a great admirer of Aristotle. She saw herself as broadly within the Aristotelian tradition and thought he was a giant on which Western civilization rested. But she thought one of his main errors is he gets this great metaphysical foundation of basing things in entities and great epistemological foundation of identifying logic as a self-conscious methodology, and there are rules based on the nature of things, of being qua being, right? He has this whole view that she thinks is great. And then he destroys it all by taking his metaphysical views as if he can deduce facts about reality, like that there is this unmoved mover spinning the spheres of the world, right? And her view is that that's not what metaphysics is. Metaphysics is not a categorization of the kinds of things that exist, or the basic sort of like structure of the way the whole world works. No, it's the basic facts about reality that are generally known and knowable to any man through sort of direct awareness that shape his whole life. So it's really important to any man in any context to know that he is conscious. It's not important, and in fact not knowable just from perception, exactly what brain configurations result in consciousness. And that's not a philosophical question to Rand.
Okay. I guess I'm still a bit confused, like, so it's kind of clear to me how, like, physicsy stuff could move and could result in, like, motion or, like, have, like, sort of physical properties. If, like, consciousness is some process, like, if consciousness is some process that physical things do or cause, then, like, I don't understand why, like, why would I not think of that as physical, or how is that different from just, all the other processes that physical stuff causes?
Yeah. So, I mean, the difference is, so this is where I go back to my earlier point about the concept physical arises in the context of differentiating the physical from the mental, right? So if we look at physical properties, right? Physical properties are things like motion and weight, or properties or actions or physical concepts in general, are like motion or weight or object or things known purely extrospectively. Now, the fact that something is caused by, and not just caused by in the sense of A before B, but caused by like A simultaneous with B, like it is if the mental aspects are, and they are, not if, but mental aspects are inseparable from the physical things that are going on, right? It's not like you have the physical stuff going on and then there just happens to be consciousness after or alongside. No, like it's one process, which is neither wholly physical nor wholly mental. But to talk about the mental aspects is in fact to separate them from the physical. To talk about the physical aspects is in fact to separate them from the mental. So if we're going to talk about how they're integrated, either one possibility, and this ultimately depends on the direction the science goes, is we have just ultimately laws about, we can describe a certain situation mentally, and we can describe a certain situation physically, and we can describe the necessary relations between those situations, right? When you're in this certain physical state, this is the way your mental state will be. But the this is the way your mental state will be in mental terms. right? It won't be in physical terms, even though it results from physical stuff, even though it's causally downstream of physical stuff, even if it requires a certain physical arrangement. You are in fact talking about mental properties. And importantly, vice versa, certain mental states will impact physical states. Now that's if the ultimate scientific view keeps this separation. I think it's also possible, and by possible I mean we can't rule out on philosophical grounds. Not that I have a specific theory of how this would work. We can't. The ultimate scientific view on this will actually be no. There's some other conceptualization which simply doesn't admit of this distinction between physical and mental at all scales. And it turns out that there are some phenomena that we just can't say are cleanly physical and clearly mental. And then in that view, the things which are now physical will still be physical, but we'll know, okay, when this sort of third way of being, which is more fundamental than either, when it's this kind of way, it's definitely physical. When it's this kind of way, it's definitely mental. And when it's that kind of way, it's neither. And so what? Like, there's no philosophical problem with that. It still will be the case that for man at the level of normal life analysis, there is the mental and there is the physical and there is a distinction between those. Just like if you say, look, from a certain perspective, the line between gaseous and liquid, right? There are certain things that are sort of in between gas and liquid. And like really at the molecular level of analysis, there's just molecules moving around in various levels of freedom. Okay, that's true. It doesn't erase the fact that there is such a thing as a liquid. There is such a thing as a gas. Those distinctions still matter and are still real. And in fact, we've learned more about them, like under what circumstances. And we've learned that there's a borderline. Okay, so maybe that will be the case with consciousness. It doesn't matter philosophically.
Okay, well, there's a bunch of directions we could go, but we've spoken for almost 3 hours now. If listeners are interested in, like, I don't know, learning, following your thoughts or learning more about like objectivism, where should they go look?
So if they want to follow my thoughts, the primary place right now is my Twitter, at SHLEVY, which I chose that name before I ever considered pronunciation. And I don't really have none of the pronunciations are good. Some people I say SH Levy, some people say Shlevy or Shlevy, whatever. But that's my Twitter. And on a lot of different fora, that's my handle. I have a website, shealevy.com, SHEALEVY.com. It's out of date right now, but I want to bring it back up and I want to do more long form writing there. And in particular, if I start doing long form writing that's not there, I will definitely post it there. So those are the places to follow me. If you're interested in objectivism, to me, the primary thing, the most important thing there are two paths. If you're interested in it, if you're really not interested in the fiction, if a fictional approach doesn't appeal to you, read Rand's essay, Philosophy, Who Needs It? It's available online. And Daniel, I sent the link to you. Can you add it to show notes or?
Yeah. Yep. So yeah, all of the things you mentioned, I'll, as long as you don't mention too many things, I'll add them to the show notes.
Okay, great. Philosophy, Who Needs It is Rand herself in the essay basically says, I'm not in this context promoting objectivism per se, but I'm promoting philosophy and my particular view of philosophy. And I think if you understand why philosophy is important and what philosophy is, and then take it seriously, I think you would then be motivated to read the rest of Rand's work. So that's my sort of nonfiction pick. But the fiction, I think the fiction is incredible. I think it is, if you only had one, I would do that. So go read The Fountainhead or Atlas Shrugged. The Fountainhead is more on the level of an individual than, and Atlas Shrugged is more analyzing this at the level of society. Fountainhead they're both very philosophical, but The Fountainhead is, I don't want to say less philosophical, but it's more, I think you would be less disturbed by explicit philosophical disagreement in reading The Fountainhead than an Atlas. So depending on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing for you.
Sure.
So in different moods, I prefer different ones. So those would be my recommendations. And then from there are a bunch of, so Rand has a whole nonfiction corpus. She's got several different anthologies of essays based on different topics. So depending on what's interest. So I would look at those. And then there's the Ayn Rand Institute, which I recommend their educational program, the Ayn Rand University. which allows auditors as well as graded students. And there's a whole program there. They have a lot of different classes, and they have a lot of sort of free offerings on their app of like different lectures that are on many, many different subjects. So go to, I think it's AynRand.org is the sort of entry point. Yeah, AynRand.org is the entry point there, and look from there. And then they have a YouTube channel, which is the sort of cultural commentary. To be completely honest, it's not my favorite. Maybe that's because I always know what they're going to say, and they're sort of talking to a general audience. So maybe it would be better for someone who's not into it yet. And then the last thing I'll mention, just one more resource, is Yaron Brook, Yaron Brook. He has a YouTube channel which has sort of a mostly daily news update. Again, from it's not speaking objectivism, but it's obviously from an objectivist perspective, as well as longer form commentary that I think is, again, I don't always agree with everything he says. He's not like my favorite absolute best philosopher, but he's got the most content. He's covering a lot of each issues. I think he would give you a taste of what it could be like.
All right. Well, yeah, I'll have a link to those in the description. Shea, thanks for talking with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And I'm happy to do it again if there's interest in more.